I took the trip in late September of 2022. The summer crowds had already thinned out, and the weather was starting to cool down in the hills around northern Idaho. I was 31, single, and had just finished a long-term project at work that burned me out completely. I had no desire to be around people for a while, no interest in going out drinking or talking to anyone about how stressed I was. I just wanted quiet, real, thick silence. I wanted to feel the world without all the noise we wrap around ourselves every day. I packed up my black Tacoma with all the gear I'd need: tent, food, stove, water filter, first aid kit, knife, bear spray, clothes, boots, fire starter, backup everything. I made a list and checked it twice because I didn't want to end up halfway up a mountain and realize I'd forgotten something basic like matches. I wasn't new to this kind of trip. I'd done a lot of solo hiking and camping in my 20s, mostly in the Colorado backcountry. But this would be the longest solo trip I'd taken in a while. For nights, 5 days, no reception, no people, just me and the woods. I picked a spot in the Panhandle National Forest, up near the Montana border. It wasn't a well-known trail. I found it on a forum where a guy mentioned it in a comment from a few years back. He said the lake up there was cold and clear, and he'd seen nobody for 3 full days. That was all I needed to hear. I parked on a dirt turnoff about 30 miles east of Sandpoint, checked the lock on my truck, and slung my pack over my shoulders. It was heavier than I remembered from past trips, but I figured I'd adjust after the first mile or two. The first few hours of hiking were smooth, steep at times, but manageable. The trail twisted through dense pine, with patches of birch that rattled their dry leaves when the wind picked up. There was that sharp, clean smell of pine needles and cold dirt, and every now and then I'd catch sight of deer trails or scat. I saw a pile of moose droppings that looked fresh, but I didn't spot any actual animals. I made it to the lake by late afternoon. It sat low in a shallow bowl of rock, half-ringed by steep cliffs and thick forest. The water was glassy, dark green, with no sign of algae or trash or even footprints near the shore. I set up my tent on a flat stretch about 30 yards from the lake, near a small outcrop that could break some of the wind. I cleared the ground of pine cones and sticks and got the tent staked in tight. Then I got a fire going. Not a big one, just enough to cook and keep warm when the sun dipped. That first night was peaceful. The temperature dropped fast after sunset, and the sky went from orange to deep blue and then black. I watched the stars come out, ate freeze-dried beef stew from a metal pot, and sat by the fire until I couldn't keep my eyes open. I crawled into the tent, zipped up the sleeping bag, and fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the trees. The next day I spent exploring. I followed a game trail that led up the ridge to the north, climbing until I could see the whole lake from above. It looked even more remote from up there. No tire tracks, no old campsites, no litter, just wilderness. I took a few pictures with my phone, even though I knew I wouldn't be able to send them until I got back. I came back down by early evening and filtered some water from the lake to refill my bottles. The water was cold enough to sting my fingers. That night, something felt off. Not wrong, not dangerous, just off. It started when I was eating. I just finished a packet of chili mac when I heard something move in the trees behind me. Not the wind, not a squirrel. A solid, deliberate snap. A heavy footstep. I stayed completely still and listened. Nothing followed. I waited another 5 minutes, thinking maybe it was a deer that caught my scent. I slowly got up, grabbed my flashlight, and scanned the woods. I didn't see anything. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up thinking I'd heard something. Twigs snapping, movement outside. But each time I unzipped the sleeping bag and sat up to listen, there was only silence. Thick, suffocating silence. The kind that gets inside your ears and makes you feel like you're hearing your own heartbeat. The third day was colder. I stayed close to camp, mostly chopping firewood from a deadfall I'd found and reinforcing the small fire pit with more rocks. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed something strange near the shoreline. On the rocks, about 20 feet from the water, was a long, thin strip of dark fabric. At first, I thought it was mine. Maybe something fell out of my pack. But when I picked it up, it wasn't mine. It looked like a sleeve torn from a jacket, black nylon with a Velcro strap and part of a zipper. It was dirty, but not decayed. not weather-worn. I stared at it for a while, trying to figure out how it got there. I walked the shoreline in both directions. No other signs of gear. No prints, no wrappers, no tools, no other clothes. Just that one sleeve. I took it back to camp and set it near the fire ring. I didn't want to keep it in the tent. That night was worse than the one before. I was nearly asleep when I heard something heavy walk through the brush. Closer this time. Definitely bipedal. I sat up fast and grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the sound. But again, there was nothing. No eye shine, no movement, just silence after the footsteps stopped. I stayed up most of that night, sitting near the fire with the bear spray in my lap. Every 10 minutes I scanned the woods, shining the light into the trees, checking behind the rocks. I kept the fire going until sunrise. The next morning I made the decision to pack up. I didn't feel right staying another night. I didn't feel scared exactly, just on edge, like something wasn't adding up. I packed quickly and hiked out with more urgency than I had on the way in. I made it back to the truck in the early afternoon, locked the doors behind me, and drove out fast. I didn't tell anyone about the sleeve or the noises, or the way I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me for at least 2 nights. I told myself it could have been a hunter, poacher, someone who didn't want to be seen. But there had been no tire tracks near the trailhead. No other camps. No scent of smoke. Nothing. A week after I got home, I kept thinking about it. I couldn't shake the image of that jacket sleeve lying on the rocks. I ended up calling the local ranger station. I told them where I'd camped and what I found, and I asked if anyone else had gone missing up there. The guy on the phone paused a second too long before saying no, nothing recent. He thanked me for the report and said they'd send someone to check it out. A few weeks later, I got curious and searched for missing persons cases in northern Idaho. I didn't expect to find anything, but one result made my stomach flip. A hiker named Derek Callahan had gone missing in September 2021, almost exactly a year before I went. His truck had been found parked near a small trailhead east of Sandpoint. He told his brother he was heading to a remote lake in the forest and planned to be out for 3 nights. They never found him. They searched the area for weeks, but no trace turned up. No gear, no camp, no body. The picture they used in the article showed Derek wearing a black nylon jacket. The same kind of jacket the sleeve had come from. I sat there staring at that photo, the hair on my arms standing up. I couldn't breathe for a few seconds. I felt cold. It wasn't just nerves. It was a deep, twisting fear that settled right in my chest. That place, those woods, that lake was where he disappeared, and I had camped in the same exact spot. I must have been only a few yards from where he'd set up. Maybe I was right on top of where he'd vanished. I didn't call the ranger station again. I didn't tell anyone else what I found. I didn't want to deal with the follow-up, the questions, the possibility that I'd brushed right up against something I shouldn't have. I haven't gone camping since. I still go on hikes, but only during the day and only on marked trails with cell reception. No more solo trips. No more remote spots. I gave away most of my gear a few months after I got back. Not because I was scared I'd see something again, but because I knew that if I did, if I ever heard those footsteps again out in the trees, I might not get the chance to leave next time. Whatever happened to Derek, it happened quietly, without a scream, without a sign. Just one man alone in the woods who never came back. I was lucky. I know that now, and I'm not interested in pushing my luck a second time. It was October of 2018 when I decided to spend a long weekend alone at a cabin I had rented deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 36 years old then, working a job that drained every bit of energy I had during the week. The city had become loud in ways I hadn't noticed before. People were always rushing, and the sound of traffic and construction had started to feel like nails on a chalkboard. I needed silence. I needed to be alone somewhere quiet, somewhere far from everything. So, when I found this small listing online for a secluded cabin near a place called Alder Creek, it felt like a perfect idea. No neighbors for miles, no cell service, no internet. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive up took me nearly 6 hours. The last part of it was nothing but dirt road that twisted through thick trees. Leaves had turned deep red and orange, and they fell constantly onto the road like confetti. I kept the windows up because the cold air cut sharp even during the day. I remember thinking how peaceful it all looked. Sunlight pushing through branches, no other cars in sight, not even a mailbox. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, it was already late afternoon. The place was smaller than I imagined, but clean and sturdy, with siding, tin roof, a stone chimney. There was a little shed about 20 feet off to the side, half hidden behind trees, and a narrow path that led down toward the sound of running water. Inside, the cabin was simple. A twin bed, a small wooden table, a chair, and a cast iron stove. No power, but there were a few lanterns hanging on hooks, a pile of chopped wood, and a hand pump for water at the sink. I had brought enough supplies to last me through the weekend. Canned food, a camp stove, flashlight, spare batteries, matches, and a first aid kit. I wasn't trying to rough it, but I wanted quiet, and this place had it. After unpacking and settling in, I lit a lantern, cracked open a beer, and just sat on the steps outside, listening to nothing but trees rustling and the occasional snap of twigs from animals I couldn't see. That first night passed quietly. I slept well, bundled in layers with the fire keeping the room just warm enough. In the morning, I made instant coffee and walked around the property. The path led to a small creek with cold, clear water. I sat on a rock and watched it move around fallen branches. There was no sign of other people anywhere, not even trash or boot prints. It was one of the few times in my adult life I felt truly alone in a good way. Later that day, I decided to check out the shed. It had an old padlock, but the key had been left on a hook inside the cabin. The door creaked loudly when I pulled it open. Inside were the usual tools: an axe, handsaw, some rusty garden tools, a gas can, and what looked like a stack of old wooden crates pushed against the back wall. Nothing unusual. The air smelled like old wood and gasoline. I didn't spend long in there. That evening, I made a small fire outside and sat under the stars. There were so many stars. Without city lights, they looked like they were doubled in number. I ate a cold can of beans and sat quietly, watching the fire until it burned down. I felt content. That was probably the last moment I truly felt that way. It started with sounds, very faint at first. On the second night, as I was lying in bed, I heard what I thought was a branch snapping outside. Nothing unusual in the woods, so I ignored it. But then I heard it again. Not just a snap, but a deliberate crunch, like someone stepping on leaves. I sat up, turned off the lantern, and listened. For a while, it was completely quiet. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it sounded too heavy, too slow for an animal. I waited maybe 20 minutes, heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. Then it stopped. Whatever it was, I didn't hear it again that night. The next day, I tried to brush it off. Animals live in the woods. That's their home, not mine. I spent the day chopping some wood, exploring a bit further up the creek, and reading a book I'd brought. But I kept looking over my shoulder more than before. That night, I made sure everything was locked up tight. I checked the shed, closed the latch on the cabin door, and even wedged a chair under the knob. I lay in bed fully clothed with my flashlight on the pillow beside me. And again, I heard it, this time closer. Definitely footsteps, slow and spaced out, circling the cabin. I didn't move, just listened. They would stop for a long time, then start again like whoever or whatever it was standing still, waiting. At one point, they got so close I could hear leaves being pushed aside, almost like someone brushing against the wall of the cabin itself. I didn't sleep at all that night. When daylight came, I stepped outside cautiously, holding the axe I'd taken from the shed. There were faint marks in the ground, flattened patches of leaves, a few scuffed spots in the dirt, but nothing clear enough to say for sure what it was. Could have been my own tracks. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, then out toward the trees. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling that I was being watched had burrowed deep into my skin. I considered leaving that day. I had enough gas in the car, and my nerves were fried. But some dumb, stubborn part of me didn't want to feel like I had been chased away by nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe it really was an animal and I was letting my imagination run wild. So I stayed, but I didn't relax. I kept the axe with me, stayed close to the cabin, and hardly touched the food I'd brought. Everything felt wrong. That night, I barely kept the fire going. I was too focused on the woods, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees over and over. I thought maybe I could scare off whatever it was just by showing I was alert. But just after midnight, something happened that pushed everything too far. There was a sound behind the shed, a solid thump, not a twig or a footstep. Something hit the side of it. I ran toward it without thinking, shining the light on the wall. Nothing. Then I swung the beam around and caught a figure in the corner of the light. Just a flash of a person, half hidden behind the trees. It was so quick, I almost convinced myself I hadn't seen it. But the shape was clear, upright, human-sized, moving fast. I yelled, even though I knew it was pointless. There was no answer, and they were gone. I didn't go back inside the cabin. I locked the door, sure, but I sat on the floor with my back to the wall, axe in my hands, flashlight off. I didn't want to give away my position. Every sound from the woods sounded like footsteps now. Every breeze that moved the trees made my muscles tense. It was a long, endless night, and when the sun finally came up, I was shaking from exhaustion and cold. I decided to leave immediately. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes, dumped what I didn't need in the trash barrel behind the cabin, and jumped in the car. But as I drove back down the dirt road, something made me stop. About a quarter mile from the cabin, I spotted something odd on the side of the road. A piece of red fabric, torn and tangled in a branch. I got out, heart pounding, and found that it was part of a flannel shirt, just hanging there, like someone brushed past it in a hurry. Not mine. I looked around, but there was no one. I got back in the car and didn't stop until I hit the main road hours later. Back in the city, everything felt loud again, but now it was a kind of comfort. I was surrounded by people, by noise, by light. I kept thinking about what I'd seen, the footsteps, the figure, the shirt. I hadn't imagined all of it. Someone had been out there, maybe watching me, maybe waiting for me to fall asleep, maybe just messing with me, but it was real. I filed a report with the local sheriff's office once I got home. I didn't expect them to find anything, and I doubt they even went up there. I never heard back. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I still take trips now and then, but never alone and never without cell service. I got rid of the axe too. I don't like the way it made me feel, sitting there with it in the dark, listening for someone who never came inside. What scares me most isn't what happened, though. It's what didn't. Is that whoever was out there never tried to break in, never spoke, never showed themselves fully. They didn't have to. They just let me know they were there. That was enough. That's what still keeps me up sometimes. Thinking about those woods, that shed, those footsteps, is how easily someone can become a part of your weekend without ever needing to say a word. I had been trying to get away from everything for a while. Work, city noise, phone calls, people. Everything just felt heavy. I lived in a small apartment above a hardware store in Reno, and the constant hum of traffic outside my window had started getting to me. The walls were thin, and my neighbor's television was always too loud. I hadn't taken a real break in over a year, and I was getting tired of excuses. So when I finally got a full week off work, I packed up my old hiking backpack, double-checked my gear, and decided to head out solo into the Pine Forest Range in northwestern Nevada. I had done a few solo trips before, but nothing this isolated. That was the whole point this time. I didn't want to hear anyone or see anyone for days. I left early on a Tuesday morning in late September. The weather had started to cool down, but the forecast looked good, clear skies, highs in the mid-60s, lows around 40 at night, crisp but bearable. I drove west on I-80 and then turned off onto a series of rough gravel roads that led up toward Duffer Peak. The plan was to park near one of the old logging access roads, then hike about 8 miles into the woods where I knew there was a small clearing near a creek. No cell signal, no noise, no one. The trail wasn't official, just a faint path through the brush that I had mapped out using a combination of Google Earth and old topographic maps. I had it marked on my GPS watch and carried a paper map and compass just in case. I had a small tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a camp stove, food for 5 days, a water filter, and an emergency radio. It was basic but enough. The first day went smoothly. The air smelled clean. It was quiet, just the crunch of dry grass and pine needles under my boots and the occasional rustle of something small moving through the brush. I saw some deer tracks, a hawk gliding silently overhead, and heard the distant knocking of a woodpecker somewhere up the ridge. I found the clearing by the creek just before sunset. It was perfect. Flat ground, no signs of people, and a slow-moving stream about 20 yards away with cold, clear water. I pitched my tent under a group of tall pines and cooked some rice and beans on my camp stove as the sky turned a deep orange. That first night was peaceful. The stars came out, and I sat for a long time by the small fire I'd made, just listening to the water and the wind in the trees. I fell asleep fast. The next morning, I woke up feeling good. I made some instant coffee, ate a granola bar, and set out to explore a bit. I followed the creek upstream for about an hour, checking out the terrain and making mental notes in case I wanted to hike farther the next day. I found a spot where the water narrowed and picked up speed, bubbling over smooth stones. It was the kind of place you only see in forest postcards. On the way back to camp, I saw some fresh animal tracks, likely coyote or bobcat. I wasn't worried. I'd spent enough time outdoors to know they stayed away from people. Back at camp, I spent the afternoon reading, stretching out in the sun, boiling more water. Felt good to be that disconnected. No texts, no emails, no news, no people. Just the sound of the wind. But that night, something changed. Around 1 a.m, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. The forest was silent. My tent was zipped. I was warm, but something had pulled me out of sleep. I sat up and listened. It was completely still outside. Too still. No wind, no crickets, no rustling. Felt unnatural. I sat in the dark for maybe 5 minutes, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. Then I heard it. A soft, slow crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves, about 30 feet away. My heart jumped. I froze. It wasn't a deer. I knew the sound deer made, fast, skittish. This was slow and deliberate, like someone trying not to be heard. Then silence again. I stayed perfectly still, my hand gripping the small hatchet I kept next to my sleeping bag. Another crunch, closer this time. I turned off my headlamp, even though it wasn't on, just in case the tiny red charging light could be seen through the fabric of the tent. I didn't move. 10 minutes passed, maybe more, then nothing. No more sounds. Eventually, I convinced myself it might have been an animal sniffing around and left. I tried to sleep, but I never really did. The next morning, I looked around the campsite. Nothing was disturbed. My food bag was still hanging in the tree. No tracks, no trash, no signs of anything. I tried to shake it off. It's easy to let your imagination get the best of you when you're out there alone. Still, I didn't hike far that day. I stayed close to camp, collected more water, checked the area again. The day was quiet. The woods looked the same, but that feeling didn't go away. That something was off, that I wasn't really alone. That night, I set up a few things around my camp. I tied a piece of fishing line to a couple of branches and ran it around the tent perimeter about knee height. Nothing fancy, just something that might make a noise if anything or anyone walked through it. I also laid out a few sticks in a pattern near the entrance. If they got disturbed, I'd know. I stayed awake late by the fire that night. Every snap and pop from the flames made me twitch. The forest around me stayed quiet. Too quiet again. When I finally crawled into the tent, I kept the hatchet beside me and left my boots on, just in case. It happened again sometime after midnight. I didn't hear the same crunching sound this time. What woke me up was the fishing line. I heard it snap, a quick, high-pitched ting like a guitar string breaking. Then complete silence. I didn't breathe. I waited. Then I heard the softest sound, bare feet, I think, on soft ground. Slow, controlled, right outside the tent. I I grabbed the hatchet and held it tight. My heart was hammering. I thought I heard breathing, not loud, but close. Then it stopped. Just like that. I sat there for over an hour, unmoving. Eventually, the first light of dawn started to push through the trees. I waited until it was fully bright before unzipping the tent and stepping out. The sticks were scattered. The fishing line was snapped in one place and pulled to the side. There were faint impressions in the dirt, not full footprints, but enough to know something had been there. Something big and barefoot. I packed up everything fast. My hands were shaking. I didn't make breakfast. I didn't care about leaving trash. I stuffed everything into my bag and hiked out in a straight line, not even following the trail I had marked on the way in. I just wanted to put distance between me and that spot. After a few miles, I finally got a weak cell signal. I didn't call anyone. I just checked the map and saw I was about 2 hours from the highway if I kept my pace. I didn't stop. I didn't drink water. I just kept moving. I made it back to my car by early afternoon. Nothing looked touched. I climbed in and locked the doors. I sat there for 10 minutes, just breathing, trying to settle the nerves. Then I started the engine and drove straight back to Reno without stopping. When I got home, I dumped all my gear in a corner of the apartment and didn't look at it for weeks. I barely slept for days after that. Every small sound in the hallway or outside my window made me jump. I checked the locks on the doors 3-4 times a night. Eventually, the fear faded at least a little. I started telling myself maybe it was just an animal. Maybe someone else was camping out there, and we just didn't know about each other. But I don't believe that. Not really. I know what I heard. I know the way it moved. That was no camper. That wasn't some guy out for a hike. Someone was watching me. Someone got close enough to touch my tent. Twice. I haven't been camping since. I still love the forest, the mountains, the quiet. But I'll never go out there alone again. There's peace in the wild, but there's danger too. Especially from the things that don't want to be seen. Not because they're monsters or spirits or anything like that, but because they're real, flesh and blood, human, and they don't want to be found. I had been meaning to get away from everything for a while. Work was getting to me, and my phone never stopped buzzing. The pressure, the constant updates, and the crowded apartment made it hard to think straight. I decided to take a break and head out into the woods for a solo camping trip. It wasn't anything fancy, just 3 days away from the noise, alone with nature. I figured I'd go somewhere not too far from home, but far enough that I wouldn't see another soul for a while. I picked a spot I found online, a lightly used trail in northern Idaho that led to a small clearing near a lake. It looked quiet, remote, and not too popular, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed everything I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, water purifier, first aid kit, a good knife, plenty of food, and a weatherproof backpack. I made sure my GPS and compass were working and printed out the trail map in case the electronics failed. I left a message with my brother telling him where I'd be and when I planned to be back. He didn't respond right away, but I wasn't worried. He'd check eventually, and I wasn't going that deep into the wild. The drive took about 5 hours. I reached the trailhead around noon, parked my car, and locked everything inside. There were no other cars in the lot, which was a good sign. The weather was clear, and I could smell pine even from the gravel road. I loaded my pack and started walking. The trail started off wide and smooth, then narrowed after a few miles, weaving through tall pines and thick underbrush. Every step seemed to take me further away from civilization, which felt like exactly what I needed. After about 4 hours of hiking, I reached the spot. The clearing wasn't very big, maybe 50 feet across, but it was flat and soft with pine needles. The lake was about 30 yards away through a screen of trees. It was calm and completely still, like glass. I didn't see any signs of people. No beer cans, no fire rings, no boot prints. Just silence and trees. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing where the ground was the most level. I unpacked my gear, set up my little cooking station on a flat rock, and filtered some water from the lake. The sun started dipping below the trees while I boiled some rice and vegetables. When it got dark, I climbed into my sleeping bag and fell asleep faster than I expected. The first night was peaceful. I woke up only once to pee, and everything around me was dead quiet. The moonlight made the forest glow slightly, just enough that I could see shapes through the mesh of my tent. I didn't feel scared, just very alone. It was the kind of quiet that felt thick like a blanket over everything. The second day, I explored the area more. I followed the lake's edge for a while, took some photos, and tried to fish with a little travel rod I'd brought. But I didn't catch anything. Still, it felt good just to be away from everything. I climbed a small hill on the far side of the lake and found a fallen tree to sit on. From there, I could see out over the water and into the thick forest beyond. I stayed there for a couple of hours just listening to the wind in the trees and watching the water ripple. The feeling of being completely alone was refreshing. That afternoon, I started noticing something a little strange. When I got back to my tent, I saw a set of small scratches in the bark of a tree near the clearing. They looked fresh. They weren't deep, but they were long and slightly curved. My first thought was a bear or a cougar, but they were too low to the ground, and the pattern didn't match claws. Maybe a raccoon or something. I wasn't sure. I didn't think too much of it at the time. That night, I stayed up a bit later. I didn't want to go to bed too early and wake up at 4 a.m. with nothing to do. I boiled some tea and sat near the tent entrance with a headlamp on, reading a book. Around midnight, I heard something move in the woods. It was a soft sound, like something brushing against a branch or stepping on dry leaves. I turned off my headlamp and sat still. It didn't sound close, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. I listened for a while. A minute passed, then two. Nothing. I turned the light back on and went into the tent. I zipped everything up and laid in my sleeping bag with my knife within reach. I didn't fall asleep for a long time. I woke up the next morning with sunlight in my eyes and a headache from not sleeping well. The first thing I did was walk the perimeter of the clearing, looking for prints or broken branches, but I didn't see anything obvious. Whatever had moved around the night before either left no tracks or hadn't come close. Still, the feeling had shifted. I no longer felt relaxed. I felt watched. I decided I'd stay just one more night and then hike out in the morning. It wasn't that I was scared. At least that's what I told myself. But something in the air didn't feel right. I spent most of the day keeping busy, filtering water, double-checking my gear, and preparing my pack for a quick exit the next day. Around noon, I walked the trail for about a mile just to stretch my legs and shake the nerves. That's when I found something that made my stomach twist. It was a piece of fabric, a dark gray fleece scrap, tangled in some branches on the side of the trail. It looked like it had been torn, not cut. I picked it up. It wasn't old, there was no mold or rot, just dirt and some snags. I looked around but didn't see any other trash or signs of people. No footprints, no gear, no wrappers, just that one torn piece. I left it where I found it and walked back a little faster than I'd come. When I got back to my camp, I started noticing more things. Small things. A tiny pile of stones near a tree that I didn't remember seeing before. A long stick leaning against a branch like someone had propped it up. My pack, which I had left zipped, had the top pocket open. I checked it, but nothing was missing. I started thinking maybe I hadn't closed it all the way. Maybe the wind knocked it around. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I forced myself to eat something and stay calm. As the sun went down, I kept a small fire going. I wasn't planning to sleep. I sat by the fire with my back against a tree so nothing could come up behind me. I kept my headlamp off and just watched the forest. The fire crackled. The trees barely moved. Around midnight, I heard it again, movement. But this time it was closer, just past the trees. A soft crunch of leaves, then silence. Then another step. I held my breath. I couldn't see anything. I picked up my knife and stayed completely still. The fire gave off only a faint glow now. I couldn't even tell which direction the sounds were coming from. Then it stopped again. I waited. 10 minutes. 15. Nothing. I doused the fire with dirt and water and slipped into the tent, leaving the rain fly off so I could see through the mesh. I didn't sleep. I stared at the woods, scanning for any movement. Every little noise. An owl, the wind, a falling pine cone. made me flinch. At some point, maybe around 3 or 4 in the morning, I started hearing breathing. Not loud, not labored, just slow and steady breathing coming from behind the tent. I froze. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just breathed. I waited, barely breathing myself. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I stayed like that until the first light started breaking through the trees. As soon as it was light enough to see clearly, I packed everything in a rush. I didn't eat, didn't boil water, didn't care. I threw everything into the pack, stomped out the fire pit, and started walking fast down the trail. I didn't run. I didn't want to make noise, but I didn't stop either. Every sound in the forest felt like a threat. I kept turning around, looking over my shoulder, scanning the woods. The hike back took 3 hours. My legs were aching and my back felt like it was about to snap from the overloaded pack. But I didn't stop. When I finally saw my car at the trailhead, I almost cried. I threw the pack in the back seat, locked the doors, and sat there shaking for a minute before starting the engine. I didn't stop until I was halfway home. I pulled into a gas station, went to the bathroom, looked at myself in the mirror, and barely recognized my own face. My eyes were bloodshot, my cheeks sunken, and I looked like I'd been in a fight. When I got home, I unpacked everything and checked my gear. That's when I noticed something that still makes my skin crawl. My knife, the one I'd kept beside me every night, had a small smear of something near the tip. It wasn't rust. It looked like blood, just a tiny bit. I hadn't used it, hadn't cut anything since the first night. I checked my sleeping bag, my tent, everything. No rips, no cuts on me. I still don't know how it got there. I never reported anything. I didn't have proof of anything illegal, and I didn't want to sound crazy. But I haven't gone camping since. I still think about that third night, about the breathing, about the scratches on the trees, about the open zipper. I don't know if someone was out there watching me or just passing through, but I know I wasn't alone. Something was out there, something that didn't want to be seen, and that was enough to make sure I never went back. It was just supposed to be a weekend trip, a simple camping getaway with nothing more than the usual tents, a campfire, and some time away from the grind of daily life. But looking back, I can't help but think that maybe it was the way I ignored that small, uneasy feeling that things might go wrong. The plan was simple enough. I'd drive out to the nearby state park with a friend of mine, Matt, and set up camp near a remote lake. We'd been there before, a few times actually, and each time it had been peaceful, quiet, and uneventful. We'd fish, hike, cook on the fire, and just relax. No big deal. But there was something different this time. Maybe it was the weather, clouds rolling in faster than usual. Maybe it was the strange feeling in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't shake. Matt and I had planned for this trip over the course of a few weeks, and I should have noticed how easily he'd dismissed any concerns I raised. He'd been the one who suggested the spot by the lake, and I should have remembered how he talked about how untouched and isolated it was. Maybe if I had known what to look for, I wouldn't have felt the way I did. But it was too late by then. I had already agreed to the trip, and so there we were. We arrived at the campsite in the early afternoon, the kind of warm weather that made you sweat just by moving too quickly. The dirt roads were a bit rougher than I remembered, and the trees were more crowded than usual, as if they had grown taller over the past year. The sound of birds was almost too quiet, almost absent, but I brushed it off. Matt was already unloading the car, his usual energetic self, not giving a second thought to anything that might seem off. The campsite was remote. We'd been here before, but it felt a little different this time. There was an odd stillness in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. The lake, which usually had a calming effect, looked almost lifeless. The water was unusually still, and the surface had an odd, almost oily sheen to it. I can't really explain it, but it didn't sit right with me. After setting up the tent and getting the fire going, we decided to take a quick walk around the lake. The woods around the camp were thick with trees, but the ground was soft, almost marshy in places. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, but when I looked around, all I could see were trees and shadows. Matt didn't seem to notice anything odd, as usual, and kept talking about his plans for the weekend. He was focused on the hike, excited about it, and didn't seem to mind the strange silence of the woods. It was when we reached the far side of the lake that things started to feel off. Matt and I were standing by the water, throwing stones in, just goofing around, when I saw it. A flash of movement across the water. It was quick, just a blur, but I swear I saw something on the other side of the lake. At first, I thought it was an animal, but it didn't move the way an animal would. It didn't move at all. It was as if it was just standing still like a figure in the distance, and then it was gone. I didn't say anything to Matt. He wouldn't have understood, and I didn't want to ruin the mood. But the uneasy feeling was there, gnawing at the back of my mind, growing with every step we took toward the campsite. The night came fast. We had dinner by the fire, the usual camping food: beans, hot dogs, marshmallows. The stars were almost completely hidden behind the clouds now, and there was a strange heaviness to the air. Matt was oblivious, of course, and I didn't want to spoil his fun, so I kept quiet about the feeling of unease creeping up my spine. But as the night wore on, things started to feel more and more wrong. I didn't sleep well that night. The fire had died down, and the silence outside the tent felt too thick, too oppressive. Every small sound seemed amplified: branches snapping in the distance, the rustling of leaves, the softest whispers of wind. At one point, I woke up to the sound of something moving just outside the tent. Not the usual sounds of animals, but something heavier, like footsteps. My heart raced. I barely dared to breathe, straining to hear if the noise would continue. But it stopped. There was no more sound, and after what felt like an eternity, I finally drifted back to sleep. When I woke the next morning, Matt was already up, cooking breakfast over the fire, talking about the day ahead. He didn't seem at all concerned, but I felt like something had shifted overnight. The trees around us seemed taller, darker, and the world felt wrong. It was like the campsite had changed overnight. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the lake was still eerily calm, as if it was waiting for something. We decided to take another walk, just to clear our heads. But as we walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. There was no sound, but I could feel eyes on me, like someone or something was moving just out of sight, staying just far enough away so I couldn't get a good look. I turned a few times, but all I could see were trees, shadows, and the occasional animal darting across the path. By the time we turned back, I was on edge. I didn't want to say anything to Matt. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I was starting to realize something wasn't right. The closer we got to the campsite, the more oppressive the air felt. It was like the woods were closing in on us, trapping us. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. The air outside was thick with tension, and I kept hearing strange noises: whispers, scratching sounds, soft tapping. It was as if the forest itself was alive, moving, watching. I kept my flashlight on, scanning the trees, but I saw nothing. And then, just after midnight, the sound came again. It was louder this time. Definite footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling our campsite. My heart was racing as I reached for the knife I'd brought with me, the one I kept beside me in the tent. I was sure someone was out there. My skin prickled, and every nerve screamed that something was wrong. I could feel the presence of whatever it was, just outside the tent, moving around us. I held my breath, listening for any hint of movement. The footsteps stopped right outside, and for a long, agonizing moment, everything was completely silent. Then, just as quickly, the sound started again, this time closer, as if whatever it was had moved just a few feet nearer. I wanted to shout out to Matt, but my voice wouldn't work. I felt paralyzed, frozen in place. I could hear him breathing in his sleep, unaware of the danger just beyond the tent walls. And then the strangest thing happened. The sound stopped. There was no more movement, no more scratching, no more footsteps, just silence. Deep, oppressive silence. I waited for what felt like hours before finally daring to peek outside. There was nothing, just the same empty, quiet woods. But that didn't make me feel better. It only made the fear grow. It was too quiet now, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. The next morning, Matt was still oblivious, as if nothing had happened. I couldn't take it anymore. I told him we needed to pack up and leave. We hadn't planned on leaving early, but something in me was screaming that we needed to go, and we needed to go now. As we packed up, I noticed something strange. The ground around our tent was covered in fresh footprints. They weren't animal tracks, they were human. Large, heavy footprints, as if someone had been walking around us all night. And they were fresh. The dirt was soft, and the impressions were deep. Matt didn't believe me when I showed him, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. I could see that he was starting to feel it too. We packed the car as quickly as we could, and with one last look at the campsite, we left. The drive home was quiet. We didn't talk much. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us. But there was nothing. The woods were behind us now, but the feeling remained. When we got back to town, everything felt normal again, but I couldn't shake the memory of those footprints. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been watched the entire time. Whatever had been out there, whatever had been circling our campsite, had been real. We never went back to that spot, never even considered it. It was a place that left a mark on me, a place where something I can't explain made its presence known. And even though I know we got away, part of me will always wonder what was really out there in those woods, waiting. It was late September when I decided to take a short solo camping trip to clear my head. I'd just gone through a rough stretch, work stress piling up, an argument with my brother, and the feeling that I was running on autopilot for weeks. I needed space. Time alone in the woods always helped me reset. I didn't want to go anywhere too remote, just far enough to feel disconnected from everyday life. I picked a state forest in northern Pennsylvania, a place I hadn't been before but had read about online. It had primitive sites, no cell signal, and miles of trails weaving through thick woods, rocky ridges, and a few quiet streams. I packed my gear the night before, my old tent, a decent sleeping bag, plenty of food, a water filter, basic tools, a flashlight with extra batteries, a camp stove, a map, and a few backup items just in case. I'd been camping solo for years, so I felt confident in my routines. I left early in the morning to make the 3-hour drive north, arriving at the forest by early afternoon. The access road was gravel and wound deep into the trees. I passed maybe one other vehicle before I reached the parking area at the trailhead. I signed in at the small wooden station, hoisted my pack, and started hiking in. I chose a backcountry site that was about 2 miles in, near a bend in a creek, nestled between a stand of pine and a short slope rising to a rocky ridge. It wasn't an official site, just a flat clearing someone had clearly used before. There was a ring of blackened stones for a fire pit and logs set up like benches. It was quiet, peaceful, just the wind moving through the branches and the distant rush of the creek. I set up my tent, gathered dry wood, and filtered water from the stream. The rest of the afternoon I spent walking around the area, noting landmarks, deadfall clusters, mossy boulders, a thin deer trail nearby, so I could find my way back easily. I had no cell service, which I expected, but it still felt strange being that cut off. Even so, I liked it. That night, after a simple meal of rice and canned beans heated on my stove, I sat by the fire and listened to the forest. Distant owl calls, the sharp crack of branches far off, probably deer moving through. A few small animals rustled in the underbrush closer to camp, but nothing unusual. When the fire burned low, I climbed into my sleeping bag and lay there listening to the soft hum of insects and the occasional breeze brushing against the tent. I fell asleep quickly. At some point in the night, I woke up. It was still dark. I didn't know what time it was. Something had stirred me. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. I held my breath and listened. It wasn't a loud sound, more like the absence of the usual night noises. No crickets, no rustling, just stillness. Then I heard what I can only describe as footsteps, slow, deliberate on dry leaves, off to the right of the tent. Not close, but not far either. I stayed still. I didn't have a weapon, just a small camp knife, but I didn't reach for it. I didn't want to make any noise. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Nothing. After what felt like a long time, the normal forest sounds slowly returned. I must have laid there for another hour before sleep finally pulled me back under. In the morning, I got out of the tent and looked around the area. I didn't see anything out of place. No footprints, no broken branches. Just my own tracks from the day before. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. Maybe a raccoon. I made breakfast, shook off the nerves, and decided to go on a long hike. I brought a day pack with essentials and left a marker near my camp just in case. I followed the trail along the creek, cutting deeper into the forest. The terrain got more rugged as I went. I passed a few old logging roads, now overgrown, and some decaying tree stands from hunters long gone. About 4 miles in, I reached a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. There was an old fire ring there too, and what looked like a collapsed wooden structure, maybe a hunting blind or makeshift shelter. I poked around a bit, then sat down for lunch. I didn't see or hear anyone else the entire time. That's when I noticed something weird. A crushed water bottle, not old, with a torn label. It didn't match any of the brands I had. Then I saw a ripped-up tarp half buried in leaves, and a section of paracord tied around a low branch. Nothing alarming by itself, but it didn't look like old debris. The items didn't have much weathering. Someone had been there recently, maybe even this season. I didn't want to linger. Something about the place felt wrong. I packed up and started back, taking a different route that looped around a ridge to avoid retracing my steps. That's when I got turned around. I noticed it when I passed the same strange stump twice, jagged like it had been split by lightning. I had my compass, so I adjusted and pushed west, which should have brought me back to the stream. But after an hour, I was still surrounded by unfamiliar trees and terrain that didn't match what I remembered. I wasn't panicking yet, but I was sweating more, moving faster, making mistakes. Eventually, I recognized the top of a ridge I had passed earlier in the morning and used that to reorient myself. When I finally reached camp, the sun was lower than I wanted it to be. My legs ached, and my nerves were frayed, but I was relieved to see my tent still standing. I tossed down my pack and sat for a while. Then I noticed something subtle. My firewood pile had been disturbed. Not much, but the top pieces weren't where I'd left them. I tried to tell myself maybe a small animal had moved them, but they were stacked neatly, and the shift didn't look like random rooting around. It looked like someone had tried to move them quietly, carefully. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the flashlight next to me, flicking it on every time I thought I heard something. The woods felt different, like they were holding their breath. I stayed zipped up, listening for footsteps, voices, anything. Once, just after midnight, I thought I saw a flicker of light through the trees, like a flashlight beam far off, but it disappeared before I could be sure. I told myself again that it could have been a trick of my eyes, maybe even distant headlights through the forest somehow. Still, I barely slept. The next morning, I packed everything quickly. I wanted out. The place didn't feel right anymore. I was breaking down the tent when I found something that made my stomach drop. Just under the edge of the rainfly, half buried in the dirt, was a cigarette butt. I don't smoke. I hadn't seen any sign of other campers nearby. It hadn't been there when I set up. I stared at it for a long time, then picked it up with a stick. The filter was slightly bent, dirt smudged on the paper, but otherwise fresh. No mold, no moisture. I finished packing and hiked out, moving fast. I kept checking behind me. Every snapping twig or bird call made me flinch. I didn't relax until I reached the parking area and saw my car sitting there, untouched. The only other vehicle was gone. I didn't wait around. I loaded up and drove out, gravel spitting behind my tires. I didn't tell anyone about it when I got home. It felt too strange, too uncertain. There wasn't a clear event, nothing dramatic, but I knew what I'd felt. I'd camped alone in dozens of places before. I knew the difference between regular forest sounds and something that wasn't normal. I kept replaying the night footsteps, the disturbed firewood, the cigarette. I even looked up reports from that area, missing hikers, strange encounters, anything. I found nothing solid. A couple of posts online about people feeling uneasy in that part of the forest, but no real incidents. Weeks passed. I tried to let it go, but one evening, I was organizing my gear in the garage, and I unrolled my tent to air it out. As I did, something small fell out of one of the folds. It was a scrap of lined paper, torn unevenly, with 2 words scrawled on it in blocky handwriting. "Nice spot." That's when it all clicked into place for me. Someone had been near my camp. They'd watched me, moved around when I was gone, got close enough to plant something in my tent. The idea of someone being that close without me knowing made my skin crawl. They didn't take anything. They didn't hurt me, but they wanted me to know they'd been there, that they'd chosen not to, and they wanted me to think about that. I threw the paper in the fire pit behind my house and watched it burn until there was nothing left but ash. That was the last solo trip I took. I still go camping sometimes, but only with friends now, and never that deep in the woods. I don't care if I sound paranoid. I've seen how easy it is for someone to slip through the trees, unnoticed, watching, and I don't ever want to feel that again. The sun had just set, leaving behind the last streaks of orange across the sky. I sat by the edge of the campfire, the crackling of the wood the only sound breaking the night's silence. It had been a quiet afternoon, the kind of calm I was hoping for when I decided to take this solo camping trip. There was something therapeutic about being away from everything. Away from work, away from people, and away from the usual noise of life. This was the first time in a while I could just breathe, stretch out my thoughts, and let everything fade into the background. I had set up camp near a small, remote lake. The path leading to it had been long, and the trail was almost overgrown, as if nature had been trying to reclaim it. But that made it perfect for someone like me, who was seeking solitude. I hadn't seen a single person since the trailhead, and the only sounds around me were the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. The lake, reflecting the deepening blue sky, seemed so serene. It was just me, my tent, and the crackling fire. As I poked the fire with a stick, the orange embers burst up into the night air, creating tiny sparks that scattered briefly before fading into the darkness. I tossed a few more logs on the fire, the smell of burning wood mixing with the fresh scent of pine. Everything felt right, peaceful. I wrapped myself in my jacket and leaned back against the log I had been sitting on, letting the warmth from the fire seep into my skin. There were no plans, no rush, just me and the wilderness. The wind picked up a bit, rustling the trees around me. I shivered slightly as the temperature dropped, but I wasn't worried. I had brought a heavy sleeping bag, and the fire would keep me warm enough for the night. As I stared at the flames, I found myself growing drowsy. It had been a long day of hiking, and despite the fact that I was alone in this vast stretch of forest, I didn't feel afraid. I was used to being out in the wilderness. This was my 3rd solo camping trip, and nothing had ever gone wrong before. The worst thing I had experienced was a raccoon stealing my food. But as the minutes passed, something about the quietness of this place started to feel a little off. It was subtle at first, like a low hum in the back of my mind. There were no more animal sounds, no distant calls from birds or the occasional rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. It was as though the world around me had held its breath, waiting for something. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The solitude was starting to get to me, that was all. I had a habit of overthinking when I was alone too long. But then, as I stared at the fire, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A twig snapped, somewhere just beyond the light of my campfire. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up straight, my eyes scanning the darkness around me. The wind had stopped completely, and everything was still. Too still. It was probably just an animal. There were plenty of small creatures in the woods, and the forest was full of life, even if I couldn't see it. Still, the snap of the twig had been too loud, too distinct. I tried to push the thought from my mind and focus on the fire, but my ears strained for any other sounds. Nothing came, just the steady, rhythmic crackling of the fire. Minutes passed. The fire continued to burn, and the woods stayed quiet. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer or a raccoon had wandered too close. I'd heard strange sounds like that before on camping trips, and they were always easily explained away. But then I heard it again, a faint rustling, followed by another sharp snap of a twig. This time it was closer, much closer. I froze, my blood running cold. My mind raced, running through possibilities. I knew there were bears in these woods, but they weren't usually this close to camp. I had hung my food in a tree, well away from the tent, just in case. Still, the idea of a bear wandering nearby made my skin crawl. The sound came again, and this time it was unmistakable. A soft shuffle, like footsteps. Someone, or something, was moving through the forest near my camp. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up as my heart pounded in my chest. Whoever or whatever was out there, I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking as I clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the dark, revealing the forest around me, but nothing stood out. The trees, the underbrush, everything seemed normal. I could hear the faint sound of my own breathing as I scanned the area. But there was no one there, no animal, no figure, just the dark, silent trees. I slowly stood up, keeping my eyes fixed on the shadows just beyond the light. My body felt tense, my muscles tight as I clutched the flashlight in one hand, a heavy stick in the other. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I wasn't taking any chances. Whatever had been out there, I wasn't going to be caught off guard. Minutes ticked by, and I stood motionless by the fire, the light of the flames flickering across the trees. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. Maybe it was just a deer. Maybe it was just the wind again, playing tricks on me. I wasn't sure. But then, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were clearer, closer. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving toward me. The sound was deliberate, too precise to be an animal. I could hear it moving through the brush, the faint rustle of leaves and the soft snap of twigs underfoot. I spun around, my flashlight casting erratic beams across the forest, but I saw nothing. There was nothing there, nothing I could point to. My heart pounded in my chest as panic began to settle in. I tried to steady my breath, telling myself it was nothing, that it was just the wind or some other natural explanation. But something deep inside me told me that wasn't the case. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing, just the eerie silence of the night. My breath came out in shallow gasps as I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. I kept the light trained on the trees, my eyes scanning the shadows. I had no idea who or what was out there, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. The unease that had been creeping up on me all night was now a heavy weight in my stomach. It wasn't just a bear. It wasn't just an animal. This felt different. I took a slow step back toward my tent, my eyes never leaving the darkness beyond the fire. Every rustle, every shift in the wind made me jump. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was suffocating. I wasn't alone out here, that much was clear. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a shadow moving between the trees, just beyond the range of my flashlight. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow was tall, slender, and moving with purpose. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a figure slipping between the trees. My heart hammered in my chest as I quickly ducked down behind a large boulder near the fire. I had no idea what it was, but it was too big, too deliberate to be some random animal. The silence stretched on, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It grew stronger, more oppressive. Whoever or whatever it was still out there, just out of sight, waiting. I tried to calm myself, to think. Should I leave? Should I pack up and hike back to the trailhead, where I might be able to find help? The thought of running in the dark, of stumbling through the woods, made my stomach churn. But staying wasn't an option either. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I grabbed my things, my backpack, my sleeping bag, and shoved them into the tent. I didn't bother folding anything properly. I just needed to move. But as I hurriedly packed up, the footsteps returned. Slow, deliberate, moving toward me. I froze. My body was on alert. Every muscle tensed as I waited for the next sound. My heart pounded so loud in my ears, I was sure it would give me away. The footsteps stopped. There was no sound now, just the quiet hum of the night. Then the voice came. It was faint, barely a whisper carried on the wind. "You shouldn't be here." I didn't know what to do. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew they were close, too close. I backed away from the voice, my hands shaking. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The words echoed in my head. I was alone, but I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath and sprinted. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get away. I wasn't sure how far I ran, how long I stumbled through the trees, until I finally broke into the open. My eyes blurred with tears as I gasped for breath, my body shaking from the rush of adrenaline. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead. The familiar sign of the path back to civilization was a relief, but I didn't look back. Not once. The next day, I went back to the site with a park ranger. My camp was untouched, the fire long gone cold. There were no signs of anything out of the ordinary. No footprints, no broken branches. It was the last week of September when I took time off from work and decided to go on a solo camping trip in the northern woods of Michigan. I had been stressed out for months, just working long days at the warehouse, dealing with people, traffic, noise, everything piling up on me. I didn't want to go somewhere touristy or flashy. I wanted to go somewhere quiet and isolated, where I could hear myself breathe, maybe fish a little, sit by the fire, and just reset my brain. I picked a spot I found online, a remote lake near the Upper Peninsula, barely marked on any map, surrounded by thick forest and only accessible by an old logging trail. The few reviews I found talked about how peaceful it was and how you were unlikely to see anyone else for days. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, fishing rod, a cooler, fire starter, a few knives, a small hatchet, 2 flashlights, extra batteries, and my old .22 rifle. I never really expected to use it, but I always brought it just in case I ran into a bear or something. The weather was supposed to be clear, maybe a little chilly at night, but nothing too harsh. I left early that morning, got coffee at a gas station on the way, and drove 5 hours north. The further I got, the fewer cars I saw. Eventually, I turned onto a dirt road, and after about 30 minutes of slow, bumpy driving, I reached the trailhead. The parking area was just a flat patch of dirt with enough space for maybe 2 cars. There weren't any other vehicles there. I parked, double-checked my pack, locked the truck, and started hiking. The trail was overgrown in places and barely visible in others. It wound through thick woods for about 3 miles until I reached the lake. It was just as beautiful as I'd imagined. The water was still and black, surrounded by tall pines and birch trees. No signs of people, no sound but the breeze and birds. I set up my tent near the edge of the lake, where the ground was flat and covered in pine needles. I had a good view of the water and enough distance from the trees to be safe from falling branches. After setting everything up, I gathered wood and built a fire pit with stones. I cooked some sausages over the flames and ate as the sun dipped behind the trees, turning the lake orange. That night, I slept harder than I had in months. Just the sound of leaves and crickets outside, the cold air pressing against the sides of the tent, and nothing else. The next 2 days were the same kind of peaceful. I spent my time walking around the lake, fishing, reading, and just sitting still. I didn't bring my phone except for emergencies, and I left it off most of the time. I saw deer once, drinking at the far side of the lake, and watched a bald eagle skim across the water. It was the kind of silence that makes you realize how noisy your life usually is. On the 3rd night, something felt a little off. I had gone to sleep like usual, after eating and tending the fire until it burned down to coals. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, not suddenly, just kind of slowly becoming aware that I was awake. There wasn't any sound, not even the usual rustling or insects. I thought maybe I'd just been dreaming, but I had that odd feeling you get when your instincts are trying to tell you something. I stayed still for a long time, listening. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I finally unzipped the tent quietly and stuck my head out. The moon was bright enough to see the outline of the trees, and the lake was smooth like glass. I waited, staring at the woods, trying to pick out any movement, but everything looked still. I figured it was just my imagination and went back inside, but I left my boots near the zipper in case I needed to get out quickly. It took me a while to fall back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately noticed something strange. There were small marks in the dirt near the fire pit. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, maybe raccoons or something, but they didn't look quite right. They were shallow, narrow, and came in from the woods. They stopped about 10 feet from the tent and then went back the way they came. I crouched down and studied them for a while, trying to figure out what made them. The shape wasn't right for deer or coyotes, and they were too far apart for smaller animals. They looked almost like the indentations of shoes, but not deep enough to be from someone walking normally. I brushed it off. Maybe it was an animal I wasn't familiar with. Maybe the ground was just soft in places and made weird shapes. I kept telling myself not to let my imagination get carried away. Still, I couldn't get that feeling out of my head, that sense of being watched. That day, I went for a longer hike, trying to shake off the unease. I circled the lake, taking my time, looking for signs of other people or anything unusual. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. I didn't even see any birds, which felt strange. Normally you'd hear at least the occasional woodpecker or squirrel. It was like everything had packed up and left. I got back to camp around 5 p.m. and rebuilt the fire. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling jumpy. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. I cooked some food and ate fast, and by the time the sun went down, I was already on edge. I made sure everything was locked up in the bear canister and pulled into the tent early. I lay there in my sleeping bag, flashlight in my hand, rifle next to me, just staring at the ceiling of the tent. Around midnight, I heard it. A single footstep outside. Just one. The kind of sound someone makes when they step on a branch and break it under their weight. Not a crash, not a bunch of movement, just one deliberate, quiet snap. I didn't move. My heart started racing, and my ears strained to pick up any follow-up noise. But there was nothing. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then I heard a faint shuffle, like something brushing against the edge of the tent, down near my feet. I didn't even breathe. My flashlight was still in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position. My other hand was slowly moving toward the rifle. I wrapped my fingers around it and waited. Every muscle in my body was locked. Another few minutes passed. Then silence again. I stayed like that for at least an hour, barely blinking. I don't think I slept at all. Eventually, the sky started to lighten outside, and I felt safe enough to move. I unzipped the tent slowly and crawled out. What I saw made my stomach drop. There were boot prints all around my tent. Human boot prints. They circled the whole thing. Some passed close by the fire pit, others led toward the woods. There were at least a dozen different impressions in the pine needles and dirt, and they weren't mine. I checked. My boots were still inside the tent, dry and clean. I hadn't walked around that night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the prints. Then I walked toward the trees, trying to follow them. They led about 20 feet into the woods and then just vanished. The pine needles made it hard to track, and I couldn't tell where the person had come from or gone. But someone had definitely been there, watching me. I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even bother folding the tent properly. Just jammed everything into my pack. I kept the rifle in my hands the whole time. When I was ready, I started hiking back down the trail, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The woods were still too quiet. No wind, no birds, nothing. About halfway back to my truck, I noticed something else. A broken tree branch hanging low over the trail, about chest height. That hadn't been there before. It looked like it had been snapped intentionally and bent across the path. I stepped over it and kept moving. Another 100 yards down, I saw a pile of small rocks stacked in the middle of the trail. That hadn't been there either. Someone was following me, or maybe they'd been ahead of me. I picked up the pace, trying not to run but moving fast. I gripped the rifle tighter, constantly scanning the trees. The last half mile felt like it took an hour. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I almost broke into a sprint. The truck was untouched. I got in, locked the doors immediately, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I just drove. The tires skidded a little on the dirt as I pulled out, and I didn't slow down until I was back on the main road. It took me a few hours to fully calm down. I stopped at a diner about 50 miles south and sat there with a cup of coffee, trying to make sense of everything. The prints, the noise, the rearranged trail. None of it made sense unless someone had been out there, watching me, messing with me. But why? There was nothing valuable in my camp. No one had taken anything. They could have hurt me, but they didn't. They just watched. When I got home, I didn't unpack right away. I left everything in the garage and sat in the living room with the curtains closed. For days, I kept thinking about those boot prints and the sound of that single footstep outside my tent. I checked local news for anything about missing people or strange reports near that lake. But there was nothing. I didn't report it to the police. What would I even say? I haven't gone camping alone since. I still think about it sometimes. About how far away that place was, how quiet it was, how whoever was out there knew I was alone. I think that's what gets me the most. They knew I was by myself. They knew exactly where I was. I was 31 the year I decided to disappear for a while. Not from anything dramatic, not from the law or someone chasing me. I was just tired. I'd worked construction for most of my 20s, long shifts under the sun, dealing with supervisors who barely remembered your name. My knees were giving out and my back felt older than my dad's. So when I got laid off in late spring of 2019, I didn't look for new work right away. I took it as a sign. I had a bit of money saved, not a lot, but enough to float for a few months if I lived cheap. A guy I knew, Rick, used to hunt in northern Wisconsin, and he told me about a place he'd stayed in, an old hunting cabin near Lac View Desert, barely an hour from the Michigan border. He said it was rustic, had no cell service, and nobody went near it after the snow melted because there wasn't much game around. It belonged to a friend of his uncle's or something. He said I could probably rent it for next to nothing if I called the owner directly. So I did. The guy didn't care much. He said if I wanted to give him $400 for the month and not burn it down, the key was under a cement frog by the door. So I packed up my old blue Tacoma with canned food, fishing gear, some tools, and a couple of paperbacks. I didn't bring a laptop. No internet. That was the point. I was going to go off the grid for a while. Just get away from all the noise. I drove up in early June. It took me almost 8 hours from my apartment in Madison. I'd never been that far north before, and the last hour of driving was nothing but trees. The paved roads turned into cracked gravel, and eventually into what felt like trails. I passed a few old houses that looked like no one had lived in them since the 90s. Faded mailboxes with names I couldn't pronounce, old trucks rusting into the earth. The cabin was farther out than I thought. It wasn't even marked. I had to turn off onto a trail that was barely wide enough for my truck. The trees were so close they brushed the sides as I drove in. When I finally got there, it was smaller than I expected. One story, maybe 20 feet wide. It had a screened porch out front and a metal chimney sticking up from the back like a bent finger. The woods around it were thick and alive. The kind of alive that's almost loud. Insects, birds, whined through leaves. I liked it immediately. I found the frog, got the key, and opened the door. The inside smelled like wood smoke and old leather. There was one big room with a stone fireplace, a dusty green couch, a table with 2 chairs, and a kitchen area with a propane stove and a dented fridge that didn't work. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a small bathroom with no mirror and a dry toilet I'd have to empty into a compost bin outside. There was a small window in the bedroom that looked out toward the woods behind the cabin. I set my bags down, cracked a beer, and sat on the porch. The only sounds were birds, the creak of trees, and the distant buzzing of bugs. No cars, no people. It was perfect. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my mornings fishing at a small stream I'd found about a half-mile from the cabin. I'd pack a sandwich, bring a folding chair, and sit by the water for hours. I didn't catch much, but I didn't care. I wasn't there for that. I'd read a lot, took naps, cooked beans and rice on the propane stove. Once or twice, I saw deer in the distance, and one morning I spotted a black bear, just lumbering across the path, not bothering with me. I kept my food sealed tight after that. By the second week, though, things started to shift a little. Not anything big, not at first. Just small details that didn't feel right. The first thing was the footprints. There was a clearing out behind the cabin, maybe 30 feet from the back door. I used it as a spot to dump compost and trash. One morning, I walked out there with a bucket of food scraps, and I saw boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. These were deep, with a square heel and a thick tread. I wore sneakers or sandals every day, nothing that would leave a print like that. And these were fresh, pressed into the damp earth like someone had walked through just that morning. I looked around, called out once, but of course there was no answer. Just trees and brush. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the property. There wasn't any fence or anything, but I figured maybe someone had been hiking. It was public land past a certain point. Still, it didn't sit right. I didn't sleep well that night. The next few days were quiet again. I tried to forget about it. Then on Thursday, I went to grab one of my tackle boxes from under the porch, and it was gone. I was sure I'd put it back. I remembered placing it beside the bucket with extra fishing line. Now it was just gone. I thought maybe I'd left it by the stream, but when I walked down there, nothing. I checked all around the cabin. Nothing. I kept my truck locked, but I checked that too. Nothing. Now I started to get that feeling. You know, the one. Like someone's been in your space. Like the air has changed and doesn't belong to you anymore. That night, I sat up late, reading on the porch with a lantern. I kept listening for sounds, for movement. A few times I thought I heard something. Sticks cracking, a low shuffle in the trees, but it could have been anything. Could have been a raccoon. Could have been the wind. But the next morning, I found something that made it all feel real. On the window outside the bedroom, on the outside, was a greasy handprint. Full-sized, right in the center of the glass. Like someone had leaned forward and pressed their palm flat against it. 5 fingers, smudged with dirt or oil. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I hadn't seen or heard a single car since I got there. No visitors, no neighbors, no reason anyone would be out here. It was too far, too hidden. Whoever left that handprint knew I was here. They'd come up close to the cabin. They'd looked inside. That day, I cleaned the rifle I'd brought. I'd only used it once for target practice, but now I loaded it and kept it beside the bed. I didn't sleep well again. Every sound outside made me sit up, heart pounding. 3 days passed. Nothing happened. I didn't go to the stream anymore. I stayed close. I kept the doors locked. I peered out the windows before stepping outside. I told myself maybe it was just a hiker, some random weirdo passing through. But then came the worst night. It started like any other. I ate dinner, just beans and eggs, and sat on the porch until the sun dipped low. The light in the woods went orange, then blue, then gone. I went inside and locked the door. I turned off all the lights and laid in bed with the rifle beside me. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. No loud sound, no dream. Just that sharp, silent kind of waking where your brain tells you something's wrong. The window was open. I never opened that window. It was small, hard to crank, and didn't have a screen. But now it was cracked open an inch, just wide enough to let in cold air. I sat up in bed and stared. The moonlight made the room glow pale blue. My heart thudded like a drum. And then I saw movement. A shape just outside. Not a face, not a clear figure. Just something there, low and hunched. Like someone crouched beside the cabin wall, just beneath the window. Waiting, listening. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just sat frozen, staring at that inch of black space between the window and the frame. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. After what felt like forever, the shape shifted. It stood slowly, like someone pushing up from a crouch. And then it moved away. I didn't hear it walk. I just saw the shadow slide out of view. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink, I think. I sat up until morning, holding the rifle, eyes locked on that window. When it was finally light, I walked outside. There were more prints in the dirt now. Not just in the clearing, right outside the window. Deep and messy, same boots. And on the side of the cabin, scratched into the wood with something sharp, was a line. Just a single horizontal gouge, as long as my arm, carved low into the wall, like someone had dragged a knife or a key straight across it. That was it for me. I packed that day, shoved everything into the truck as fast as I could. I didn't care about cleaning. I didn't care about the trash. I just needed to get out. I didn't even go back to lock the door. I drove until I hit the main road, then farther until I had bars on my phone again. I pulled over in front of a gas station and just sat there, letting my hands stop shaking. I didn't report it. What could I say? That someone was near my cabin? That I saw a shape in the night? There was no proof, no faces, no names. Just tracks and a handprint. I never went back. Later, I told Rick what happened. He said the owner of the cabin didn't want to hear about it. Said the guy was old, didn't care, probably wouldn't even fix the window. That was 6 years ago. Sometimes I still dream about that window, about the inch of open space and the shape crouched outside. I still lock every door and check every window, even if I'm just going to bed in my apartment. I wanted quiet. I wanted to get away from people. But the thing is, you never really know who's out there. You think I was 34 the summer I took 2 weeks off work and went off the grid. It was 2018. I'd been living in Pittsburgh, working tech support for a cybersecurity company, pulling long shifts, dealing with angry customers and barely sleeping. I wasn't exactly falling apart, but I could see the cracks forming. I found the cabin listing on some obscure travel blog. It wasn't Airbnb or any of the big names. Just a single post titled, "Secluded Getaways. Real isolation for the worn-out mind." It featured a few hidden spots in the Northeast, and the second one caught my eye, an old hunter's cabin up in the Allegheny National Forest, near a place called Elkridge. The listing mentioned no Wi-Fi, no cell service, no electricity, just a generator, a water pump, and silence. That's what sold me. The guy who owned the cabin, a man named Vernon, communicated only through email. He sent me a map, an actual hand-drawn map scanned into a PDF, and told me not to rely on GPS because it would stop working 5 miles before I got close. I liked that. I needed to be unreachable. I needed space from the digital noise. So I paid him half up front through PayPal and set the dates for mid-July. I packed light, a duffel bag of clothes, a few basic tools, some dried food, a propane burner, 2 water jugs, a hatchet, a small survival knife, and my hiking boots. I didn't bother with my laptop, and I left my work phone in a drawer back home. I brought a notebook and a paperback, just in case the quiet got too loud. It was a 5-hour drive north from Pittsburgh. I reached Elkridge around noon, a tiny logging town with maybe 24 buildings and not a single traffic light. I filled up on gas at a rundown station, grabbed a couple more granola bars and a bag of ice, then followed the map Vernon had given me. The road narrowed into a dirt path just past an abandoned ranger station. The map told me to keep going until I passed a small wooden sign that read, "Trespassers will be shot." Then take a left and drive a mile into the trees. That's where I found it. The cabin was exactly as described. Small, maybe 20 feet by 25, with a sagging roof and moss-covered steps leading to a creaky front door. The windows were old and cloudy, like they hadn't been cleaned in years. There was a fire ring out front and a rusted folding chair beside it. The generator sat off to the side under a tarp, humming softly when I flipped it on. Inside, the place was basic. 1 room with a cot, a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a small counter with shelves. A narrow door led to what I guessed was a composting toilet. There was no shower, no fridge. The air inside smelled like dust, wood, and the faintest trace of mildew. I dumped my gear, opened a window, and sat outside for a while. The forest stretched out around me like a wall. Thick trees, no sounds but birds and the occasional rustle of something moving in the underbrush. Felt untouched, and it felt good. The first 2 days were everything I hoped for. I cooked simple meals, wrote in the notebook, took long hikes along barely there animal trails, and listened to the wind move through the trees. At night, the darkness was complete. No streetlights, no distant hum of cars, just blackness and the chorus of insects. I hadn't realized how much I missed that kind of silence until I was surrounded by it. But by the third day, I started noticing things. Small things. Nothing big enough to ring any alarms, not at first. Just details that felt off. The first was the firewood. When I arrived, there was a neat stack beside the cabin. Split, dry, ready to burn. But on the third morning, I noticed a few pieces had been moved. Not taken, just shifted, like someone had grabbed a few logs and set them down again. I thought maybe an animal had knocked them over. But there were no claw marks, no droppings, no sign of anything digging. Then there was the footprint. I found it near the creek about a half-mile from the cabin. Not mine. I was wearing thick-soled hiking boots. This was from a different kind of shoe, worn, thin-soled, maybe a work boot. It was partially smudged in the mud but deep. Someone else had walked through there recently. Still, I told myself not to spiral. It was probably Vernon, the cabin owner, checking on the place. Or maybe a hunter scouting the area. Even if the cabin was remote, it didn't mean I was the only human for miles. That night, I left the generator running a bit later. I didn't like the idea of being watched. I didn't hear anything strange. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept imagining the crunch of footsteps outside, the creak of the front steps. Every gust of wind felt like movement. I finally dozed off sometime after 3 a.m., the flashlight gripped tight in my hand. Day 4, I hiked farther out, toward a ridge that overlooked the valley. It was a clear day, and from up there, I could see for miles, just endless green, hills rolling into the horizon. I sat there for a while, calming down, convincing myself the cabin wasn't being watched, that I'd let my imagination get the best of me. On the way back, I noticed something that stopped me cold. About 200 yards from the cabin, hidden behind a dense patch of brush, was a path. Not an animal trail, a man-made one. Someone had cleared branches, trampled grass. It was recent. I followed it for maybe 20 yards before it curved toward the west and disappeared into thicker trees. I didn't go farther. I got back to the cabin and double-checked the door locks. There weren't many, just a flimsy bolt and a latch, but I wedged a chair under the handle too. I didn't cook that night. I sat in the dark, generator off, waiting. Nothing happened. No knocks, no sounds. But I didn't sleep. Day 5 was when things changed. I woke up to find the folding chair gone, the one outside by the fire ring. I'd left it leaned back against the cabin wall. Now it was just gone. I circled the area for 20 minutes, thinking maybe it got blown over or an animal dragged it. Nothing. Then I checked the fire pit. It had been disturbed. Someone had tried to start a fire. There were small charred twigs in the center, arranged carefully, but never lit. I packed my bag. I didn't care that I had another week booked. I was done. I had the map, I knew the way out. But the road had other plans. I walked the mile back to the dirt road and kept going toward the ranger station where I'd entered. It should have taken me less than 2 hours on foot. But the path was blocked. Trees, big ones, had fallen across the road like they'd been cut. Not storm damage. These were clean breaks. Someone had dropped them with a chainsaw. I backtracked, heart pounding, thinking I must have taken a wrong turn. I hadn't. That's when I noticed something else. At the edge of the fallen trees, nailed into the trunk of one, was a new sign. It wasn't there when I came in. It was a flat wooden board, spray-painted red with crude white letters. Not safe. Go back. I stood there for a long time, not sure if I should laugh or cry. It didn't feel like a prank. Felt like a warning. I turned back toward the cabin, brain racing. Who was out here? Why block the only road in or out? Why now? I didn't go back inside. I grabbed my gear from the porch, stashed food and water in my pack, and decided to hike the ridge trail again. From there, I could maybe spot another way out. Even if I had to bushwhack for hours, I figured I'd eventually hit a road or house. I made it to the ridge before sunset. From up there, I scanned every direction. Then I saw it, movement. Below, maybe 300 yards from the cabin, was a figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes. They weren't walking. They were standing, still, facing the cabin. I didn't move. I watched for 10 minutes. They didn't budge. I crawled back from the ridge on my stomach, heart hammering in my throat. Then I circled wide, staying in the trees until nightfall. I didn't go back to the cabin. I didn't light a fire. I found a spot between two boulders and hunkered down, wrapped in my jacket, knife in hand, every twig snap making me flinch. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. The sound of a chainsaw in the distance. Not close, but not far either. Just revving, stopping, then starting again. I stayed frozen. It lasted maybe 5 minutes. Then silence. The next morning, I moved. I followed the sun, heading east, keeping low, staying off trails. I rationed my food, drank from the creek, purified it with iodine tabs. I hiked for hours, legs burning, eyes scanning every direction. I didn't see anyone, but I felt watched, constantly. On the second day of hiking, I finally saw a sign of civilization. A barbed wire fence, rusted and sagging, marking the boundary of what looked like a long abandoned farm. Beyond that was a dirt path, and a mile later I saw the outline of a building, another ranger station, this one intact. I stumbled into the lot, banged on the door until someone opened it. An older guy in uniform stared at me like I was a ghost. I told him I'd been hiking, got lost, needed help. I didn't mention the cabin. Not yet. It was the fall of 2014 when I decided to take a break from the constant buzz of life in the city. I was 32 at the time, single, and working long hours in IT. My days had become a blur of screens, deadlines, and emails that never stopped coming. I felt burnt out and restless. So when a friend mentioned a cheap rental cabin in the woods upstate, tucked near the edge of Pine Hollow Preserve, I took it as a sign. He'd stayed there once during college and said it was nothing fancy, but peaceful, just what I needed. The cabin was about 3.5 hours from where I lived in Philadelphia. I left early on a Thursday morning to avoid traffic, driving through fading towns and long stretches of empty back roads. As I got further north, the trees thickened and the air turned crisp. I rolled down my window a bit just to take it in. It was early October, and the leaves were starting to turn. Gold, orange, a few patches of bright red. The kind of scenery that looked fake if you saw it in a painting. The directions my friend gave me were pretty straightforward. The cabin was about 40 minutes past the last gas station in a town called Lasker, down a gravel road with no name, just a faded sign nailed to a tree that read Pine Hollow. I found it easily enough. The gravel crackled under my tires, and the road narrowed the deeper I went, trees crowding closer, their branches sometimes brushing the roof of my car. No cell service past Lasker, but I'd expected that. I had a paper map in the glove box just in case. The cabin came into view about a mile in, small, weathered but solid looking. It sat on a slight slope overlooking a long, narrow lake, its surface glassy and unmoving. No neighbors in sight, no other houses, just trees and silence. I parked my car, grabbed my duffel bag, and unlocked the front door with the key my friend mailed me. The place smelled like old wood and dust. It had clearly been a while since anyone stayed there. The main room had a couch, a small kitchen area, and a wood stove. There was one bedroom and a tiny bathroom that had a flush toilet but no shower, just a sink. Water came from a well pump out back. No Wi-Fi, no TV. Power was solar, but there was a backup generator in the shed out back if needed. It was perfect. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, swept out cobwebs, and opened all the windows to air the place out. Made myself a simple dinner on the propane stove, canned soup and crackers, then sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the trees across the lake. The silence was thick, almost alive. Not oppressive, but heavy. A kind of quiet you forget exists when you live around people too long. That night, I slept like a rock. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds and the wind moving through the trees. I made instant coffee, sat out on the porch again, and just listened. There were no engines, no people, just nature. I felt my chest loosen for the first time in months. I spent most of the day exploring the area around the cabin. There was a trail that followed the lake's edge, overgrown but walkable. I found a couple of animal tracks in the mud, maybe deer. I took a few photos with my phone, even though I knew I wouldn't be able to upload them until I got back. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, I noticed something small but strange. One of the front windows was open. I was sure I'd closed them all earlier, but I figured I'd missed it, shrugged it off, and latched it shut. That night, I built a fire in the wood stove and read a paperback I'd brought. Around 9 p.m., I turned off the lights and climbed into bed. The wind had picked up and the trees groaned a little outside, but otherwise it was calm. I woke up just after 1 a.m. The air was cold. I pulled the blankets tighter and lay still, not sure what had stirred me. Then I heard a faint creak. Not the trees, not the wind. It was sharper, closer. I sat up and listened. Came again, this time more distinct. A floorboard, I thought, shifting. I told myself it was the cabin settling. Old houses do that. But then I heard it again. Not just one creak, but 2, 3 in a row. Like footsteps. I stayed frozen in bed, barely breathing. The cabin had no insulation, and every sound traveled. I strained to hear more, but the noise stopped. I waited for what felt like 10 minutes, heart thumping. Nothing, just silence again. Eventually, I chalked it up to my imagination, or maybe an animal on the porch. I drifted back to sleep around 3. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I hiked a bit further along the lake, then made a sandwich for lunch. Back at the cabin, I did a slow walk around the outside, just to reassure myself. Nothing seemed out of place, until I looked at the back door. There were scratches along the wood near the handle. Not deep, but definitely there and fresh. Not the kind of weathering you see from age or storms. These were narrow, straight marks, like someone had tried to pick at the lock or pry it open with something thin. My skin crawled. I checked the door. It was locked. Still, I felt unease settle in my stomach like a stone. I told myself again it could have been animals. A raccoon maybe, or a porcupine. But something about the marks seemed deliberate. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept checking the locks. The wind blew harder, and branches tapped against the windows. I left the light on in the bedroom. Just a small one, but enough to cut the dark. I kept the axe I used for chopping firewood next to the bed. I knew it was overkill, but it made me feel better. I fell asleep eventually. I woke again, this time to the unmistakable sound of the front porch boards groaning under weight. Not the wind, not some squirrel, something heavier. I didn't move. I listened, heart racing, to the steady crunch of weight shifting on old wood. Pause. Another step, then another, right outside the door. I waited, barely breathing. Then nothing. Minutes passed. I stayed still. When the sun finally rose, I got up and opened the front door. The porch was empty. No sign of anything. No footprints. But I knew what I'd heard. That was the day I decided to drive into Lasker and buy a set of trail cams. I figured if it was an animal or someone, I'd know for sure. I made the drive, picked up 3 cams, batteries, and a couple of protein bars for good measure. I was gone maybe 3 hours. When I got back, something was off again. The welcome mat was slightly crooked. Not the kind of thing you'd normally notice, but I remembered setting it a certain way that morning, centered. Now it was askew. I checked the locks. Still latched. I installed the cams before sunset. One facing the back door, one overlooking the front porch, and one pointing down the trail leading to the lake. I set them to record movement. That night, I barely slept. The following morning, I checked the footage. Front porch cam, nothing. Back door cam, nothing. Trail cam, movement at 2:17 a.m. I replayed the clip. First, it was just the trees swaying. Then a figure appeared. A man. He stepped into frame slowly, half-crouched, moving with intent. He wore dark clothes, a hood pulled up, and gloves. He moved off trail and toward the trees, heading in the direction of the cabin. But the clip ended before he came close enough to be seen clearly. I watched it a dozen times. I didn't call the police. I should have. But what would I say? That a guy walked near my cabin in the woods? I didn't even have a plate number. And there was no service anyway. I could have driven back into town, but something made me stay. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. I decided I'd give it one more night. Just one. I kept the axe by the bed again, set up a few makeshift noisemakers, tin cans strung with fishing line, across the porch and near the back. Anything to give me a heads up. That night it was quiet for hours. Then the cans rattled. Not a gust, not a bump. They rattled. I jumped up, turned on every light in the cabin, and stepped to the door with the axe in hand. I didn't open it, just stood there, heart hammering, listening. Footsteps again. This time, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun rose, I went out. The cans had been tripped, the line pulled taut. Boot prints in the dirt. Size 11 maybe, fresh, leading around the cabin, then veering off into the trees. I packed my things, left the cams where they were. I drove out of Pine Hollow without looking back, heart still pounding hours later. 2 days later, I got a call from my friend, the one who recommended the cabin. He told me to check the footage when I got home. He'd seen something on the news. A man had been arrested in a town 30 miles from Pine Hollow. They found him squatting in a hunting shack. He had tools, gloves, and a long record breaking and entering, stalking, assault. No one had known he was in the woods. No one had seen him until he tried to break into a ranger station during the night. I checked the footage again. It was him. Same build, same clothes. I was lucky. He never got. It was early September of 2017 when I decided I needed a break from the city. I had just turned 31, and life had been pulling me in too many directions at once. I worked in insurance, mostly behind a desk, trapped under fluorescent lights, and answering calls from angry people who didn't read their policies. I had no family in the city, few friends, and the kind of persistent fatigue that builds up slowly over the years without you even realizing it. One morning, I stared at my face in the mirror, pale from the artificial light and lack of sun, and said to myself, I need out. So I booked a week off work, packed up my car with some basic gear, and drove north. I didn't have a solid plan, just a general direction. I ended up in northern Oregon, near the border with Washington. I'd found a place on an old backpacking forum, not an official campground, more of a local spot known among hikers and loners. It was called Seven Pines Ridge. The guy who posted about it said it was quiet, isolated, and beautiful. A ridge that ran along a forgotten section of forest just off an old logging road, with a small stream running through it. Sounded perfect. No people, no signal, and no noise. Took me nearly 5 hours to get there. I left Portland around 6 in the morning, took I-5 north, then veered off onto a bunch of state routes that twisted through small, almost forgotten towns. By the time I turned off the paved road onto the dirt track that led to the ridge, my GPS had stopped working. I didn't mind. That was kind of the point. The dirt road was rough. My old Subaru groaned over rocks and dipped into deep ruts, the kind that make your stomach rise just a bit if you go too fast. Trees pressed in from both sides. The forest felt old, damp, and undisturbed. I passed a rusted sign nailed to a post. Asterisk, Seven Pines Ridge Trailhead, no services. Asterisk, it was tilted. The lettering faded. I parked in a small clearing that barely fit my car, grabbed my backpack, and headed in on foot. The trail was narrow but visible. Moss covered almost everything, trees, rocks, even fallen logs. After about an hour of hiking, I found a flat patch near the stream, not far from the ridge's edge, where the trees thinned just enough to get a sliver of a view to the west. You could see rolling tree-covered hills that stretched out for miles. It was perfect. I set up my tent, built a small fire ring from nearby stones, and sat on a fallen log, just listening. No cars, no people, just wind in the branches and water trickling through roots and rocks. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some beans on my little camp stove, drank water from my filter bottle, and wrote in a small notebook. I slept surprisingly well. The air was cold, but fresh. I woke with the sun, sore from the ground, but clear-headed for the first time in months. The second day, I hiked further up the ridge. I didn't see a soul. There were no wrappers, no fire pits, no beer cans. Signs I'd come to expect even in untouched areas. This really was remote. I found some deer tracks near the stream and once saw what I thought might have been a coyote, but it darted away before I could get a good look. That night, I stayed up later. The stars were insane. No light pollution, just a sky bursting with pinpoints of white, a dome of silent infinity overhead. It was the third night when things started to feel off. It began with a sound. I just crawled into my sleeping bag. The fire had burned low, just red coals glowing faintly. I was halfway between sleep and wakefulness when I heard it. A snap, not a twig underfoot, not that sharp dry crack, but more like a dull pop, like a thick branch being twisted and broken. I sat up, listened. The forest was still, but not silent. Crickets chirped. Something small moved through leaves nearby, probably a squirrel. But then I heard another sound, closer this time. A slow crunching like footsteps, heavy, deliberate ones. Then silence. I told myself it was just an animal. A deer maybe, or an elk. But I'd grown up hiking in Montana. I knew the sound of animals moving through brush. These weren't quick, light, or erratic. They were slow and spaced like someone walking. I stayed still, hand resting on the knife by my pack. I didn't sleep much that night, just lay there, ears straining in the dark. Morning came and everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I walked the perimeter around my site, didn't find any footprints, but I did find something odd. A tree about 30 yards from my tent, freshly gouged with marks. Not scratches, not like claws, but long vertical lines that looked like they'd been made with a blade. Clean, deliberate cuts. 3 of them evenly spaced. I told myself it could have been old damage. I told myself I hadn't noticed it earlier. I went about my day as usual. Hiked some, collected wood, filtered more water. But I kept glancing at that tree. That night it rained. Not heavy, just a cold drizzle that crept into your clothes and stuck. I stayed in my tent, wrapped in my bag, reading a paperback. Around 1 a.m., I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. This time there was no wind to blame, no dry branches to snap in the breeze. The sound came from just beyond my tent, from the direction of the stream. It moved slowly, deliberately, circling wide. I lay frozen. My knife was under my pillow. I slid my hand toward it, heart hammering. Then I heard a low thud, like something being dropped, followed by silence. I didn't sleep. When the sky finally lightened, I stepped out. The drizzle had stopped. The forest smelled like wet leaves and earth. At the edge of the stream, I saw it. A pile of rocks, stacked deliberately, 5 of them, each one placed with precision like a little monument that hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of it. Now I started to feel genuinely unsettled. Someone was nearby. I packed my things. Fast. Took down the tent, shoved everything into my backpack, and headed back down the trail. I figured I could make it to the car in under an hour if I moved fast. But about 15 minutes in, I stopped cold. There were boot prints in the mud, deep ones, fresh, leading toward my campsite. They weren't mine. I wear trail runners. These were heavier, like work boots, treaded, large, size 11, maybe 12. They weren't there when I came in. I felt like I was being watched. I started walking faster. Every sound behind me made my skin crawl. At one point, I even broke into a jog, heart pounding. When I finally reached the clearing, my car was there, untouched. No signs of anyone else. But I didn't feel safe until I was back on the paved road, reception bars lighting up on my phone. I drove to the nearest town, a place called Oak Hollow. Tiny. A single gas station, a diner, and a post office. I sat in the diner for an hour, just nursing coffee and staring at the table. My thoughts were racing. Was it a hunter? A drifter? Someone living off-grid? Why come so close to my tent? Why leave the rock pile? Eventually, I booked a room at a motel and stayed the night. I couldn't go back to the ridge, and I didn't want to go home yet either. I needed to clear my head. But the story doesn't end there. A week later, back in Portland, I kept thinking about it. I told myself I'd imagined things. Maybe I'd been on edge, sleep deprived, but I couldn't stop wondering. So I did something I probably shouldn't have. I went online and searched for Seven Pines Ridge. Not the hiking forum, I went deeper. Old news stories, obscure blogs, local reports. That's when I found it. An article from 2004, archived in a local newspaper. A missing hiker, a man named Greg Walters, 29. He'd gone missing near Seven Pines Ridge. His car was found at the same clearing I'd parked at. Search and rescue found his tent, undisturbed. His gear was still there, but he was gone, never found. There was another case, 2011. A woman, same spot. Her tent was slashed open. Her pack was found a mile away. She was later found wandering the forest, barefoot, incoherent. She'd refused to speak to authorities. Eventually ended up in a psychiatric facility. I felt sick. This wasn't just in my head. I never went back. I sold the camping gear, changed my car, moved to a different apartment. I don't even go to public parks anymore. I still think about that third night. The sound of the steps, the rock pile, the knife marks in the tree. Someone was there watching me, not trying to kill me, just watching, waiting. And that's what haunts me the most. It wasn't what happened. It's what could have happened if I had stayed one more night. The night felt cold, far colder than it should have been for the middle of October. The cabin was small, nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest road or any signs of civilization. I had rented the place for the weekend to escape the stress of city life. A few days alone in nature sounds peaceful, right? The kind of peace that's almost unsettling. I had arrived late in the afternoon. The last stretch of the road was narrow, winding through dense trees that blocked the sunlight, turning everything a dim, muted shade of gray. The cabin itself sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by thick woods. It was old, probably built decades ago, with a slanted roof and weathered wood that seemed to groan with every gust of wind. This porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it. I wasn't expecting luxury, just a place to relax. But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something felt off. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked underfoot as I moved through the small living area. The place smelled old, like mildew and forgotten memories. A small fireplace dominated one wall, and a set of mismatched furniture filled the rest of the space. There were no curtains on the windows, just empty glass panes, which seemed odd for a cabin this isolated. The bare light bulbs hanging from the ceiling flickered when I turned them on, and the single bathroom had a sink that dripped incessantly, making the silence even more unbearable. I shrugged it off, thinking I'd just gotten too used to city life and needed to adjust to the stillness of the woods. I unpacked my bag, set up a small fire, and made dinner. A simple meal I cooked over the open flame. The sun sank behind the trees as I ate, casting long shadows over the cabin. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves in the trees. The fire crackled, and I thought about the quiet nights I'd spent camping in places like this before. It should have felt like a return to normal, but something about it didn't sit right. The silence outside wasn't peaceful. It felt too empty. I sat in front of the fire for a while, listening to the wind and watching the flames dance. Then, out of nowhere, a thud came from somewhere outside, sharp and loud enough that it made me jump in my seat. My heart raced for a second as I froze, staring into the shadows outside the cabin. Nothing. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just the trees shifting, maybe a branch falling or an animal moving through the underbrush. I had read a lot about the sounds the woods could make, so I chalked it up to that. But then came another thud, louder this time, closer, almost like something or someone was walking around the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. The wind didn't help. It howled and rattled the windows, but through that, I thought I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate. I stood up and moved cautiously to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing. No movement, no shapes, nothing. I decided to check the locks on the doors, just in case. Even though I told myself it was nothing, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there. The locks were old, rusty, but secure enough. I checked the windows too, making sure they were all latched tight. Satisfied for the moment, I sat down again by the fire, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. The night wore on. I tried to relax, but every little creak of the cabin made me tense. Each gust of wind felt like it was pushing against the walls, and every whisper of the trees outside seemed like it was trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. Eventually, I decided to turn in, needing to get some sleep to make it through another day of quiet in the woods. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined I heard the footsteps again, slow and purposeful, moving around the cabin. Each time, I would shoot upright, heart pounding, only to find the room dark and still. The fire had burned down to embers, casting eerie shadows against the walls. But nothing was there. Hours passed. I don't know when I finally drifted off, but when I woke, the sun was already up, casting a grayish light through the cabin's bare windows. I felt groggy, as if I hadn't slept at all. The air inside the cabin felt colder, even though the fire had died down long before I'd gone to sleep. I decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. I pulled on my jacket and stepped outside. The world around me was still, but it wasn't a peaceful stillness. It was an oppressive one. There was a heaviness in the air, as if the forest was holding its breath. I walked to the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I noticed something strange. The ground around the cabin was covered in a thin layer of fallen leaves. But there, right in front of the cabin's porch, the leaves were disturbed. It looked as though something had been dragged across the ground, leaving deep, uneven impressions in the earth. The marks led off into the woods, disappearing into the trees. I froze. Could have been an animal, but these weren't the kind of tracks I'd expect from any wild creature around here. They looked too deliberate. Without thinking, I followed the tracks. My feet moved almost on their own, and I soon found myself deep in the woods, the trees closing in around me. The tracks led to a small patch of dirt, but that's not what made me stop in my tracks. What stopped me was the sound, something like scraping, coming from the far side of the clearing. I wasn't sure whether to move closer or turn back, but I had to know. Slowly, I stepped forward, my feet barely making a sound on the damp earth. I reached the edge of the clearing, where the trees were thickest. Then I saw it. A pile of branches and leaves had been stacked in a makeshift shelter, and next to it, a large wooden crate sat half buried in the dirt. I approached cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. The crate was old, and it had been there for a while, the wood rotting from years of exposure. But what bothered me the most was what I found inside. A collection of discarded objects, old blankets, a few cans of food, and a flashlight that looked like it had been used recently. Everything was covered in dirt and moss, as if someone had been living here. I stepped back, a chill crawling up my spine. Someone had been here, and recently. I didn't wait around to figure out who. I turned and ran back to the cabin, my breath coming in short bursts as I stumbled through the trees. My mind raced. What had I gotten myself into? Who was out here with me? When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut behind me, heart still pounding. I locked the door, checking the windows again just to be sure. The footsteps, the strange marks in the ground, the shelter in the woods. It all made sense now. Someone had been watching me. Someone was out there. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? But how could they get here in time? I was miles from the nearest town. I had to leave, I knew that much. I couldn't stay here another night. But as the day dragged on, and the sun began to set again, I realized something. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger. The tracks outside the cabin weren't the only thing I had missed the first time I walked around. I now saw more marks in the ground, different shapes, different angles leading around the cabin. And the footsteps, they had started again. I was no longer alone. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Nothing more. Just a few days away from the grind of the city, a break from work, a chance to recharge. I had rented a cabin in the woods for myself and my best friend, Charlie. We'd always talked about getting away for a weekend, just to experience nature, some peace and quiet, and maybe a little fishing. I was 28 at the time, just at that stage where I had started to get tired of the city's noise. Charlie, a few years older, had been the one to encourage the trip. He'd grown up in the country and loved the idea of getting away from it all. We found this cabin on one of those websites where people rent out vacation homes. The listing had a few pictures. A simple log cabin, some trees around it, a calm river nearby. The owner's description mentioned how peaceful it was and how you could really unwind from the stresses of everyday life. Charlie had called ahead to ask a few questions, and the owner, a gruff but friendly older man named Bill, assured him that everything was in good shape. There was no phone service, no internet, and no Wi-Fi, but we'd known that going in. We were looking to disconnect. The trip took us about 3 hours to drive to the cabin from the nearest town. The last stretch of road was dirt and narrow, surrounded by thick woods. It was mid-October, and the air was cool with that crisp edge that made your breath visible. The leaves had started to change, painting the forest with hues of orange, yellow, and red. Everything felt so peaceful, almost like a different world from the one we left behind. It was hard to believe how quickly everything could change. When we arrived, the cabin was just as the pictures had shown, maybe even a bit better. It sat on a small hill with a view of a stream running through the woods. The area around it was quiet, nothing but the wind and the occasional bird call filling the air. The cabin itself was modest. One room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a loft with 2 beds. The place had an older, lived-in feel, but it was clean and cozy. The only thing that stood out was a large, sturdy door that led to a basement. It wasn't locked, but it seemed odd that it was even there in a place like this. We unpacked, and after a few hours of setting up and making ourselves at home, we decided to head out for a walk through the woods, just to get a feel for the area. It felt good to be away from the constant noise of the city. The woods were thick, and the path wasn't clearly marked, but we didn't mind. We walked along for what felt like hours, following the sound of the stream in the distance, and talking about nothing in particular. It was one of those moments when you just felt free, untethered. As we were walking back toward the cabin, I noticed something strange. A figure standing by the edge of the woods, near the tree line. It was too far away to make out clearly, but I could tell it wasn't someone we knew. It wasn't even someone who looked like they were walking toward the cabin. I pointed it out to Charlie, but by the time he looked, it was gone. "That's weird," he said, but we shrugged it off. It was probably just someone hiking or maybe a hunter. It wasn't all that unusual to see people out in these woods, but it felt strange to see someone standing still like that. I made a mental note to mention it to Bill when we saw him next. Later that evening, after a simple dinner of canned soup and some snacks, we settled in by the fire. The cabin had a wood stove, and the heat it gave off was enough to take the chill out of the air. We had a couple of beers, played cards, and listened to the crackle of the fire. It was nice. Too nice, in fact. We were both so relaxed that we didn't think much of the weirdness from earlier in the day. It was around 10:30 p.m. when we first heard it. A knock, soft, almost muffled, but still noticeable, came from the door that led to the basement. First, we both stared at it, wondering if we had imagined it. But no, there was no mistake. It came again, a little louder this time, like someone was tapping against the wood. Charlie stood up first, his hand on his flashlight. I followed him as he walked slowly toward the door. "You sure you didn't leave something down there?" he asked. I shook my head. "I haven't even looked down there." We stared at the door for a moment. The knock came again, a little harder this time, and we both jumped. "Who's there?" Charlie called out, but no answer came. We waited, but the silence stretched on. After a moment of hesitation, Charlie reached for the door. "I'm going to check it out," he said. "Stay here." I protested, but he was already down the steps. I listened closely as he went down the creaky stairs into the basement, the silence pressing in on me. After a few minutes, I heard a thud, followed by the sound of something scraping against the floor. My heart skipped a beat, but before I could move, Charlie was back upstairs, looking pale. "There's nothing down there," he said, his voice tight. "Just old stuff. Some boxes, shelves, nothing that could have made that noise." We were both quiet for a moment, trying to make sense of what just happened. But nothing did. So we decided to just go to bed. We locked the door behind us, double-checked the windows, and settled in for the night. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, with the only sounds being the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of the wind outside. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, little sounds, scratching at the walls, creaking in the floorboards, and that persistent tapping sound, faint but still there. I told myself it was just the house settling, that it was nothing. But the longer I lay there, the harder it became to ignore it. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to a cold chill in the room. The fire had gone out, leaving only the pale glow of the moonlight to illuminate the space. I sat up and shivered, my mind racing with thoughts of what had happened earlier. Was it just the wind? A branch hitting the cabin? I didn't know. But then I heard it again, a loud, sharp bang. This time it came from above, from the loft. I stood up in an instant, my heart pounding in my chest. Charlie was already sitting up, wide-eyed. We both stared at the loft, waiting for another sound. Nothing came. It was quiet again, too quiet. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the hairs on my neck standing up. We decided to leave, right then. We couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my backpack, throwing it over my shoulder, and we rushed out of the cabin, both of us not looking back. The woods were dark, but the moonlight filtered through the trees just enough to light the way. We didn't know what was happening or why, but we knew we had to leave. When we finally reached the car, I started the engine and we drove as fast as the dirt road would allow, not looking back at the cabin. We didn't stop until we reached the town, and even then we stayed in the car for a while, trying to calm down. Eventually, we got out, checked into a motel, and spent the rest of the night talking in low voices, still trying to process what had happened. In the morning, we drove back to the cabin to get our things. It was still there, sitting alone in the woods, just as we had left it. But the door to the basement was wide open, swinging in the breeze. Bill never really gave us an explanation when we spoke to him. He just seemed confused and told us the cabin was perfectly safe, that nothing had ever happened like that before. But we never went back. Not once. We learned to trust our instincts. Some places just aren't meant to be, and some nights are better left in the dark. It was the fall of 2023, and I was looking for a break. Proper one. No work, no phone calls, no distractions. Just me, a cabin in the woods, and the kind of silence that could make you lose track of time. I had always loved the idea of getting away, so when a friend of a friend offered me their secluded cabin up in the mountains of northern Colorado, I jumped at the chance. The cabin was about 2 hours from the nearest town, tucked away on a small, winding road that was barely a road at all. Just a dirt path that slithered through a thick forest of evergreens. I didn't have high expectations. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just peace and quiet. It seemed like the perfect spot. The cabin itself was simple, old even, but in good condition. It had been built by the friend's family decades ago, and from the outside, it looked just like something out of a postcard. Wooden beams, a stone chimney, and a small porch that overlooked a dense stretch of trees. The kind of place you'd imagine settling into with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the sun slowly rise. I unloaded my gear quickly, eager to get the place ready for my stay. The inside of the cabin was just as simple as the outside: old furniture, a small kitchen, a wood stove in the corner for heat, and a single bedroom with a queen-sized bed covered in thick, worn blankets. The kind of blankets you'd find in a place like this. The walls were lined with bookshelves that were filled with old novels and knickknacks. There was even an antique rifle hanging above the mantel. It all had that rustic, lived-in feel, like it had been untouched for years, but in a comforting way. The perfect kind of quiet retreat. I set up my things and decided to explore the area a bit before nightfall. The forest around the cabin was thick, the trees so close together in some places that it almost felt like the woods were alive, wrapping themselves around the cabin. The air was crisp and smelled like pine. I took a walk along a small trail that led off behind the cabin, feeling the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot. There was no one around for miles. It was just me and nature. That night, after eating a simple dinner, I settled into the cabin with a good book. The wind outside howled, pushing against the walls of the cabin as the storm that had been predicted rolled in. The fire in the wood stove crackled, and the cabin felt snug and safe, a welcome contrast to the wild weather outside. As the evening wore on, the wind grew stronger, and rain began to lash against the windows. Around midnight, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a soft thud. It was faint at first, like something heavy had dropped to the ground outside, but the sound repeated, slightly louder each time. At first, I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the wind or the shifting of the trees. But it was rhythmic, too consistent to be random. I lay still for a moment, listening. The wind had died down, but the thudding continued, this time closer. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the trail I had walked earlier. It was odd, but not alarming, at least not yet. I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight, which seemed absurd in that moment, as if a tiny beam of light would make any difference in the vast, dark forest surrounding the cabin. The storm outside had picked up again, so the air was thick with the sound of rain. I stepped outside and shone the beam of light around, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. Nothing. The forest around me seemed unnaturally still, and the darkness felt heavier than usual. I moved toward the back of the cabin, where the thudding had been coming from. The flashlight flickered for a moment, and when it came back on, I thought I saw something, just for a split second, moving between the trees. A deer? A bear? I wasn't sure, but I wasn't going to find out. I turned to head back inside, but then I heard the sound again, a loud, unmistakable thud. This time, it was right behind me. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. The forest was dead silent now, not even a rustle in the trees. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I convinced myself that it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other creature, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I rushed back inside, locked the door behind me, and went back to the couch. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me, but I forced myself to settle in. The rain was picking up again, and the wind howled louder than before. I tried to sleep, but every creak and groan of the cabin set my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., I heard the thudding again, but this time it was unmistakable. It was right outside the window. I jumped to my feet, grabbed the flashlight, and rushed to the window. There was nothing, just the dark, rain-soaked forest. I couldn't take it anymore. My mind was racing, imagining all kinds of possible explanations. None of them good. I debated calling someone, but there was no cell service up here, and I wasn't even sure who to call. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and it felt like something or someone was out there, just beyond the trees, watching. The thudding stopped after a while, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the thing from outside creeping closer to the cabin. I knew I wouldn't get any rest, so I decided to spend the rest of the night reading, trying to distract myself from the unease gnawing at my stomach. By morning, the storm had passed, but the cabin still felt unnervingly quiet. I forced myself to go outside and get some fresh air. The woods looked different in daylight, less menacing somehow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to take a walk down the trail again, hoping the daylight would calm my nerves. As I walked, I kept my eyes peeled for any signs of what could have made the thudding sounds. But there was nothing, just the usual forest animals and the rustle of the wind in the trees. I stopped for a moment, catching my breath, when I noticed something strange on the ground. It was a small pile of broken branches, arranged carefully, as if they had been placed there intentionally. It was an odd sight, considering how dense the forest was. No one had been out here, at least not recently. I bent down to examine the branches, and that's when I saw it. A boot print in the soft earth, just beside the pile of broken branches. It was fresh. Someone had been out here. Someone had been walking around my cabin. The realization hit me like a cold slap to the face. My heart was racing again as I retraced my steps back to the cabin. I had to get out of here. I wasn't alone. When I got back to the cabin, I started packing my things. I wasn't sticking around to find out what was going on. But as I packed, I kept hearing something from outside. Scratching noises at the back of the cabin, followed by more thudding. Then it stopped. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my gear and locked the door behind me. My car was parked at the base of the small hill leading up to the cabin, and I practically ran to it, my eyes darting nervously around the woods as I went. I didn't know who or what had been out there, but I wasn't taking any chances. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. By then, my heart had finally slowed down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Looking back now, I don't know what it was, whether it was someone who had been out there for reasons I'll never know or something else entirely. But one thing's for sure, I won't be going back to that cabin. The woods have a way of hiding things, and whatever was out there, I don't want to find out what it was. Some mysteries, I suppose, are better left unsolved. The woods were quiet that evening, the kind of quiet you only find deep in nature, far from the buzz of city lights and the constant hum of technology. I hadn't planned to stay at the cabin for long, just a quick weekend getaway to clear my head, but there was something about that place, something unsettling in the way the trees seemed to loom over the small structure. The cabin wasn't much, just a rustic one-room building with an old stone chimney and a weathered porch. But for some reason, I felt an odd sense of isolation the moment I stepped inside. I'd arrived late in the afternoon, driving up a winding dirt road through the mountains, the kind that's barely wide enough for one vehicle. The kind of place where you get the feeling that not many people pass through. The road was lined with thick pines, their tall trunks almost closing in on me, casting long, eerie shadows over the ground. By the time I parked the car and unloaded my things, it was already dusk, and I quickly realized that I hadn't planned ahead for how to get firewood. The thought of walking into the woods to gather some on my own was daunting. Everything seemed so still, so unnaturally still. I decided it wasn't worth it, that I could make do without a fire for the night. The cabin had a small wood stove in the corner, and I figured I'd be fine with just the heat from that. I'd also packed some snacks and a few cans of soup, so I wasn't too worried about food. Inside, the place smelled like old wood and dust. The floorboards creaked as I moved around, and I could hear the wind rustling through the trees outside. I set my bag down on the small bed in the corner, which was covered in an old quilt that looked like it had been there for decades. The furniture was minimal: an old rocking chair by the stove, a rickety wooden table with mismatched chairs, and a few shelves lined with books, most of which were faded and unreadable. I opened one of the windows to let in some fresh air, hoping the chill of the evening would help clear the musty smell. As I stood there, staring out at the darkening woods, I had the odd feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. No loud noises, no strange movements, but it was as if the woods themselves were watching me. I shook off the feeling and went about making my dinner, opening a can of soup and heating it on the stove. The rhythmic sound of the can opener and the low simmer of the soup filled the quiet room. I tried to distract myself with a book I'd brought along, but my mind kept drifting back to the woods outside. Every now and then, I'd hear a branch snap or the rustle of leaves, and I'd glance up, half expecting someone to be standing at the window, staring in. But of course, there was no one, just the trees. The wind picked up, and the cabin creaked in response, a low groan as the wood expanded and contracted. I finished my meal and washed the few dishes I had used. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, the only sound in the room other than the occasional pop of the stove. I didn't feel like going to bed yet, but I was already getting the sense that sleep wouldn't come easily. The night had settled in fully, the moon barely visible through the thick canopy of trees outside. I sat in the rocking chair by the stove, staring into the flames, trying to focus on the warmth and the flickering light. But even then, it felt like something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, something I couldn't explain, something pressing down on me. My eyes kept darting to the windows, where the darkness outside seemed impenetrable. The kind of darkness where you could swear something was moving just out of sight. Eventually, the pressure in my chest became too much, and I decided I needed to get some sleep. I made my way to the bed, pulling the quilt over me, though it didn't feel like it would offer much warmth. The air in the room had grown colder as the night deepened, and I wrapped myself tighter, trying to ignore the chill. I stared at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. But I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination. It had been a long drive, and I hadn't had much time to rest the past few days. Maybe I was just tired, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I would hear a sound from outside, a rustling of leaves, a crack of a twig. It sounded so close, too close, like someone or something was just outside the cabin, moving silently through the underbrush. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. There was nothing, just the wind and the occasional snap of wood. After what felt like hours, I finally drifted off, but my sleep was fitful, filled with strange, fragmented dreams. I dreamed of walking through the woods, but the trees were different. They were thicker, darker, and the air was heavy with an unnatural stillness. I felt like I was being chased, but whenever I turned to look, there was no one there, just the shadows, stretching longer and longer until they seemed to swallow me whole. I woke up with a start, heart pounding in my chest. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the stove, which was slowly dying out. I looked around the room, trying to steady my breath, but the feeling of unease had only deepened. I glanced at the window, but the trees outside were so dark that I could barely make out their shapes. It was as if the night had swallowed the world whole. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But the longer I lay there, the more certain I became that something wasn't right. I could feel it now, an undeniable sense of dread. It wasn't just the isolation. It wasn't just the silence. There was something else, something that I couldn't put into words. I lay still, listening, and then I heard it again, the sound of something moving just outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps. It sounded too heavy to be an animal, too purposeful to be the wind. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight from the table and quietly crept toward the door. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but part of me needed to see it for myself. I slowly turned the handle and cracked the door open just a fraction, peering out into the darkness. Nothing. The woods were empty. The trees stood silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I could barely see anything beyond the porch, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the blackness like a knife. I closed the door, my heart still racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was out there, watching me. I didn't know how much longer I could stand it. The silence, the creeping sense of being surrounded by something unseen, it was driving me to the edge. It wasn't until the next morning, when the sun began to rise, that I realized just how much I had been affected. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin, and looked around the cabin. There were no signs of anyone being there. No footprints, no broken branches, just the usual wilderness around me. But as I stood there, looking at the forest, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Across the clearing, near the edge of the trees, there was a large, jagged rock. And on that rock, there were marks, deep scratches, as though something had scraped its claws against it. The marks were fresh, too fresh. I didn't stay long after that. I packed up my things, locked the cabin door, and drove back down the winding road. The entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. But when I reached the main road, I looked back, and the cabin was just a tiny speck in the distance, disappearing behind the trees. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, A weekend to unwind, disconnect from the constant noise of daily life, and just enjoy the stillness of the mountains. I had rented a cabin in the woods, somewhere in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, not too far from Asheville, North Carolina. The year was 2023, and I had just turned 32. The idea was simple: a break from the city, a few days of solitude, and a chance to do some hiking, read, and clear my head. I had been to the mountains before, but never alone. My friends had always come along on previous trips, and while I enjoyed their company, there was something about being by myself in the wilderness that intrigued me. Maybe it was the challenge of being alone, or perhaps it was the need to prove something to myself. Either way, I was ready for a few days of quiet. The cabin was small but cozy, tucked away in a secluded spot near a bubbling creek. The first thing I noticed as I pulled up the gravel driveway was the silence. It was the kind of silence that settles over everything, a deep, almost suffocating quiet. There was no highway noise, no sounds of distant machinery, just the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional bird call. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like wood and pine, the kind of earthy scent that makes you feel like you're truly out in nature. The place was equipped with everything I needed: a small kitchen with an old stove and refrigerator, a stone fireplace, and a single bedroom with a large bed covered in a quilt. The windows were big, offering an expansive view of the forest, the mountains rising in the distance. It was perfect. After unpacking, I spent the first couple of hours just settling in. I stoked the fireplace and made myself a cup of tea. I didn't have a clear plan for the weekend, just the vague intention to explore, get some fresh air, and clear my mind. The surrounding woods seemed inviting, with trails that I knew would lead to all kinds of new discoveries. So I decided to head out for a short hike that afternoon. As I wandered along the trail that bordered the creek, I felt a growing sense of peace. The air was crisp and fresh, and the forest was alive with movement. A squirrel darted across the path, and a rustle in the trees signaled the movement of something bigger, perhaps a deer. The peacefulness was comforting, and I could feel the tension of the city slipping away with every step I took. When I returned to the cabin a few hours later, I made dinner, lit a few candles, and settled in for the night. The sound of the creek outside was a constant, soothing presence, and the fire crackled in the hearth. I didn't bother with the television or even a book, just the quiet, the fire, and the peace of being alone in the wilderness. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. At first, it was just a faint unease, a sense that I wasn't quite alone. I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't a noise. There was no tapping at the window or scraping against the walls. It was something more subtle. Maybe it was the silence, the way the stillness of the night seemed to press in on me, or maybe it was the isolation. But as I sat there in front of the fire, I started to feel like I was being watched. I stood up, walking over to the window to look outside. The night was pitch black, the forest nothing more than a mass of shadows. The wind had picked up slightly, but there was nothing unusual. I pushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to a combination of being in a new place and the fact that it was getting late. I made myself another cup of tea and went to bed. That night, I didn't sleep well. I tossed and turned, waking up repeatedly, each time feeling like there was something in the darkness just beyond my sight. I kept hearing faint creaks and rustling sounds, but every time I'd get up to check, there was nothing. By morning, I was exhausted, but I decided to get up early and go for another hike. The fresh air would clear my head. I made a quick breakfast, grabbed my jacket, and set out into the woods. The daylight helped, and I started to feel better, more grounded, but the nagging feeling that something wasn't right never quite left. It felt like I was being followed, even though I couldn't see or hear anything that would suggest it. I hiked for several hours that day, getting further into the forest than I had originally planned. The landscape was beautiful, with streams and small waterfalls cutting through the woods. I found a spot to sit by the water and just enjoy the solitude. But as I rested there, I noticed something strange. A series of footprints in the soft earth caught my attention. They were fresh, too fresh, and they didn't look like any animal tracks I had seen. They were human-sized, but the shape of the prints was uneven, as though the person walking had been in a hurry or was stumbling. I stood up slowly, scanning the area around me. There was no sign of anyone, but the footprints seemed to lead deeper into the woods. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and for the first time, I wondered if maybe my decision to come here alone had been a mistake. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I followed the tracks for a short distance, but they quickly disappeared as they veered off the main trail. I stood still for a few moments, listening, but all I could hear was the wind in the trees. Reluctantly, I decided to head back to the cabin. When I returned, I locked the door behind me and double-checked the windows. It was still early, but something told me I wasn't safe out here alone anymore. I made myself some lunch and decided to stay inside for the rest of the day. The feeling of being watched didn't fade. I kept catching glimpses of movement outside, or hearing faint noises that made me question if I was truly alone. By evening, I couldn't shake the sense that someone was out there, just beyond the edge of the cabin's property. I spent the night staring at the shadows in the corners of the room, the sounds of the forest no longer soothing but unsettling. The next day, I woke up to a heavy fog blanketing the woods, the kind of fog that made it impossible to see beyond a few feet. I grabbed my backpack, gathered my essentials, and made the decision to leave. I didn't care about the rental fee for the cabin. I just needed to get out of there. As I was loading my things into the car, I glanced up at the cabin. That's when I saw it. On the front porch, there was a small object, a piece of cloth. It was a dark color, possibly navy blue, and it was torn. I didn't recognize it, but I knew it wasn't something I had left behind. Panic set in. My mind raced with questions. Was someone watching me? Had they been inside the cabin? I couldn't shake the thought that whoever had been out there was still nearby. I got into the car and started the engine, looking back at the cabin one last time. The fog was thickening, and I couldn't see much, but I swear I saw a figure standing in the woods, just beyond the tree line. I didn't wait to confirm it. I drove away, not stopping until I reached the main road. As I made my way back to the city, I couldn't help but reflect on the past few days. The fear I felt was something I'd never experienced before, an unsettling, primal fear that something was out there, watching me. But as I pulled into the driveway of my apartment and turned off the car, I realized something important. The fear was gone. The strange feeling that had plagued me in the cabin had lifted. I was safe. I don't know who or what was out there or why they chose to stay hidden, but I made a vow never to go back to that cabin. I would never again let myself be so isolated, so vulnerable. The mountains, the silence, the woods, they were beautiful, yes, but they were also unforgiving, and sometimes the things that are most beautiful can also be the most dangerous. As I unpacked my things, I found that piece of torn cloth in my bag. I didn't remember picking it up, but it was there, in the pocket of my jacket. Maybe it was a clue. Maybe it was just a reminder to trust my instincts. Either way, it was the last thing I needed to see to know I was never going back. I was safe now. The weekend was over, and I could finally breathe again. It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway. I needed a break from the constant noise of city life, the constant buzz of my phone, the clamor of the traffic outside my window, the people. It was all starting to wear on me. So when I found a small, remote cabin listed for rent in the Adirondacks, I jumped on it. No one around for miles. Just me, the trees, and a lake to unwind beside. Simple, peaceful, or so I thought. The drive up was longer than I anticipated, but the scenery was beautiful. Thick forests, rolling hills, and the occasional stretch of clear blue sky. I had packed my things in the back of my old Subaru: a tent, some fishing gear, a couple of books, and, of course, the essentials. The closer I got to the cabin, the quieter the world seemed. No radio stations out here, and even my phone had no signal. It wasn't until I passed the last small town and turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin that I realized just how isolated I was. The cabin itself was small, a rustic wooden structure nestled between towering pine trees. The owners had left a note for me on the front door, a simple welcome and instructions for the key. It was exactly what I needed. No fuss, no distractions, just nature. Inside, the cabin was cozy. A stone fireplace in the living room, a small kitchenette, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub, and a lofted bedroom that overlooked the lake. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and the smell of wood and earth filled the air. I unpacked my things and made myself at home, taking my time to get comfortable. The weather was perfect, chilly enough to need a sweater, but with clear skies. I could already feel the weight of the city lifting off my shoulders. I spent the first evening by the lake. The water was still, reflecting the orange and pink hues of the setting sun. The air smelled fresh, and for a moment, everything felt right. I had no agenda, no one to answer to, just the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the distance. It was everything I had hoped for. The next morning, I decided to head out for a hike. I'd seen a trail map in the cabin, one that led deeper into the woods, around a bend, and up to a small peak that promised stunning views of the surrounding area. I packed a lunch, strapped on my boots, and made my way toward the trailhead. The trail was easy at first, a well-worn path through dense underbrush. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. I could hear the distant call of birds and the rustle of animals moving through the brush. It was exactly what I wanted, peace and quiet, broken only by the sounds of nature. But as I walked deeper into the woods, things began to feel different. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on exactly, but something about the way the trees were spaced, the way the shadows stretched across the ground, it felt unnatural. The trail started to narrow, and I had to pay more attention to where I stepped. The further I went, the quieter it became. The birds seemed to stop singing, and even the wind fell silent. The only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot. I paused for a moment, trying to shake the strange feeling creeping up my spine. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I was being watched. The thought seemed absurd. There was no one out here, I knew that. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The woods were eerily still, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if they were being swallowed up by the trees. I pushed the thought aside and continued walking. The trail dipped down into a small valley, and then began to climb again. I was halfway up a steep incline when I noticed something strange. Footprints. Fresh ones. The soil was soft, and the impressions were clear. They were large, heavy prints, likely from boots. The strange thing was they were heading in the opposite direction, toward the trail I had just come from. I stared at the footprints for a while, trying to make sense of them. It wasn't that they were odd in shape, but they seemed out of place. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail before, and there was no way anyone could have passed me without me hearing them. I wasn't exactly alone on this trail. I had seen a few other hikers earlier in the morning, but they had all been much farther ahead of me. I took a deep breath and decided to keep moving. There was no reason to panic, I told myself. It was probably just another hiker who had turned around. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The silence pressed down on me like a heavy weight. By the time I reached the peak, the sun had begun to dip lower in the sky. The view was magnificent, but something about the air felt thick, heavy. I was on edge now, my mind racing. I felt like I needed to leave. I didn't belong here anymore. That's when I heard it. A sound from behind me. Footsteps, light but deliberate. I turned around, half expecting to see someone coming up the trail, but there was no one. Just the woods. Empty. I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had taken over my body. Every part of me was telling me to leave, but I stood there frozen, staring into the trees, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The footsteps stopped, and so did the rest of the sounds. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just silence. I started to back away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes scanned the trees, looking for any sign of movement, but everything was still. After what felt like hours, I turned and ran back down the trail, not daring to look back. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door and drew the curtains. I had never been one to let fear control me, but something about today had shaken me. The silence of the woods, the strange footprints, the sense of being followed. It was all too much. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, Every rustle outside sent me into a fit of anxiety. I stayed up, staring out the window, convinced someone was out there, watching me. I thought I saw a figure moving in the trees once, but when I looked again, there was nothing. Just the dark, empty woods. The next morning, I was exhausted but determined to leave. I packed my things quickly, not bothering to clean up or tidy the cabin. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. As I started my car and pulled away from the cabin, I couldn't help but look back. The place seemed so serene from a distance. The cabin nestled peacefully among the trees. But I knew better. There was something off about that place. Something I couldn't explain. Something I didn't want to understand. I didn't come back to the Adirondacks after that. I never even wanted to look at a cabin again. Whatever had happened in those woods, whatever had followed me, whatever had made the silence feel so suffocating, I didn't want to know. I never found out who had been on that trail or why I felt so watched. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But I've never been able to shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who had been walking through those woods. And I never will. The cabin was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a break from the stress of work, a chance to unwind. It was supposed to be peaceful. I needed to escape the chaos, the constant noise, the demands of life. I thought the quiet of the woods would be soothing. The nearest town, Ashford, was an hour away from the cabin, a quiet little place with a gas station and a few scattered houses. It was May 18th, 2025. My name is Jacob Lawson, and I was 29 at the time, single, with a lot of stress building up at work. I had just broken up with my girlfriend, and I needed some space to think. I rented the cabin online. Cheap, secluded, and right on the edge of a dense forest, about 5 miles from the nearest road. The owner, a middle-aged man named Paul, had sent me a simple message: "Key is under the mat. Make sure to lock up when you leave." It sounded simple enough. I packed up my things. A few bags of clothes, some snacks, and a couple of books to keep me entertained. I made the drive out to the cabin, passing through Ashford, and taking the narrow, winding road that led deeper into the woods. It was a perfect spring day. The sun was shining, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the pictures. A small, 2-story place made of weathered wood with a stone chimney and a front porch that overlooked a small creek. It was isolated, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch for miles. I could already feel the weight of the world lifting from my shoulders. There was something calming about being so far removed from everything. I carried my things inside, put the key under the mat, and locked the door behind me. The interior was simple but cozy. There was a small kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, a couple of chairs, and a small wooden table. Upstairs, there was a loft with a bed and a window that gave a perfect view of the surrounding trees. I tossed my bags on the bed and went to unpack. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a quick meal, read for a bit, and then sat by the fire, watching the flames dance in the hearth. It was peaceful, just as I'd hoped. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant rustle of trees outside. I slept well, waking up only once or twice to the sound of animals outside. Deer, probably, or maybe raccoons. But it was the second night that things began to feel off. It started with a strange noise. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I was in bed, the cabin dark except for the soft glow of the moonlight coming through the window. There was a rustling sound coming from outside, something faint, just beyond the trees. I had assumed it was an animal, probably a raccoon or a deer, but then it happened again. And this time it was louder, almost like footsteps. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the noise kept coming. The sound of movement, heavier than an animal, like something walking, deliberately, slowly. My heart began to race. I got out of bed and went to the window, pressing my face against the cool glass. The moonlight cast long shadows on the ground, but there was nothing out there, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. I told myself it was probably just a bear, or some other animal. They often moved around the area at night, looking for food. But still, the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. I tried to go back to sleep, but every little noise outside seemed to make me jump. A crack of a twig breaking, a rustle of leaves, the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving through the brush. I kept listening, but I couldn't make out what it was. The house felt eerily still, too still. Then, just after midnight, there was a loud bang. Came from outside. I shot up from the bed, heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and quietly made my way downstairs. My breath felt shallow. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards under my feet felt deafening in the silence. I stood by the window, the flashlight in hand, but I didn't dare to shine it outside just yet. The sound had come from the other side of the cabin, by the creek. It could have been anything, a fallen branch or something hitting the side of the house. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but my gut told me otherwise. I debated calling the police, but there was no cell service here. The landline didn't work either. It had been disconnected. I was completely alone, cut off from any help if something went wrong. I couldn't just sit there and wait. The noise had unsettled me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. I grabbed a jacket, slipped on my shoes, and cautiously stepped outside onto the porch. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I wrapped my arms around myself for warmth. The light from the cabin cast a pale glow across the yard, but everything seemed calm. No movement, no signs of anything being disturbed. I hesitated for a moment, but then I walked to the edge of the property, where the land sloped down toward the creek. The sound of the water running over rocks was the only thing I could hear, aside from the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. Then I saw it, something dark and out of place against the pale grass. There, near the creek, was a large shape, a black, heavy tarp or something like it. It was thrown over a pile of something. I couldn't make out the details from where I was standing, but my instincts screamed that I shouldn't go any closer. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I walked toward it slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The closer I got, the more I realized something was wrong. The shape under the tarp wasn't just some pile of discarded trash. It was too large, too structured. My breath hitched as I reached the edge of the pile, finally seeing what lay beneath the tarp. It was a barrel, the kind used to store large amounts of something, and it was partially open. My stomach twisted, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I was about to turn away, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a footprint, a large, muddy footprint, just inches from the barrel. A footprint that didn't belong to any animal I knew. It was too big, too deep, and the mud around it was disturbed, like something heavy had been dragged through it. I didn't know what to do. Panic started to set in. I wanted to run back to the cabin, lock the door, and pretend like nothing had happened, but the image of that barrel haunted me. I couldn't leave until I understood what was going on. I bent down and cautiously moved the tarp a little further. My heart was racing now, and my mind was spinning with worst-case scenarios. What if someone had been here? What if they were watching me right now? I peered inside the barrel. It was empty, but there was something else, something far worse. The barrel had a strange, metallic smell to it, a smell that made my stomach churn. I quickly pulled away, breathing heavily, feeling lightheaded. There was no way I was staying another night here. The sense of being watched had become overwhelming, and I couldn't ignore the dread settling in the pit of my stomach. I grabbed my things and rushed back into the cabin, locked the door, and turned all the lights on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I didn't waste any time. I packed everything up as quickly as I could and left the cabin, making the long drive back to Ashford. I didn't look back. I never found out what was in the barrel, or who had been lurking around my cabin that night. But I didn't need to know. I left the keys with the owner, told him I wasn't coming back, and got on with my life. That weekend was supposed to be a getaway, but it turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. I don't know if the person, whoever they were, was just trying to scare me, or if they meant to do something far worse. But the one thing I do know is that I'll never go back to that cabin. It might have been peaceful at first, but whatever happened out there, whatever I felt, is something I can't shake. And that feeling of being watched stayed with me. Even now, years later, when I think about that cabin, I can't help but feel like I'm being watched once again. It was the first weekend of October when I decided to get away. The stress had been piling up. Work, life, everything. And I just needed some time to clear my head. So I booked a small, isolated cabin in the woods. The kind of place where cell service was spotty at best, and the closest neighbor was miles away. It felt like the perfect escape, a place where I could sit with my thoughts and enjoy some peace. I was 32, a city worker who had never really experienced the kind of solitude the cabin promised. The woods were something I had always admired from a distance but never really immersed myself in. I drove up on Friday afternoon. The air was crisp, the kind of chill that made the breath come out in little puffs of white smoke. The leaves had already begun to turn, painting the landscape in shades of amber, gold, and red. The road to the cabin was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for my car to fit between the trees on either side. I remember how quiet it was, the only sound being the crunch of gravel under my tires. It was the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I brushed it off, figuring it was just my nerves acting up. The cabin itself was exactly as advertised, small, wooden, and tucked away in a secluded area of the forest. The kind of place you would expect to find in a hiking brochure, perfect for a weekend getaway. It had a front porch with a couple of chairs, a fire pit in the backyard, and a single-story interior with a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a cozy living area. A wood stove sat in the corner, with a stack of firewood neatly arranged next to it. Everything about it seemed normal, nothing unusual at all. I unloaded my bags, set up my things, and spent the first few hours exploring the property. The cabin was nestled in a small valley, surrounded by tall trees. Beyond the immediate area was dense forest, the kind that felt like it had been here forever, untouched and wild. I had no intention of venturing too far in the dark, so I stayed close to the cabin, taking in the beauty of the place. The sunset was stunning, the last rays of light filtering through the trees and casting long shadows on the ground. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. That night, I cooked a simple dinner, some pasta and salad, and settled into the cabin. It was only me, so the space felt big, almost too big. I could hear the creaking of the wooden beams as I moved around. The wind was picking up outside, making the trees sway and groan. I didn't think much of it, just figured it was the usual sounds of nature. After dinner, I sat by the fire for a while, watching the flames dance and flicker. I had brought a book, but I didn't have much of an appetite for reading. The night was too quiet. There were no animals, no sounds of insects, nothing but the wind and the occasional snap of a branch. At some point, I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me. It was unsettling, but I told myself that it was just my imagination. I was alone in a cabin in the woods, and the peace should have been comforting, not eerie. By 10 p.m., I was starting to feel a little uneasy. I shut off the lights, took a quick shower, and crawled into bed, hoping sleep would come quickly. But it didn't. The bed was surprisingly uncomfortable, and every little noise from outside seemed louder than it should have been. The wind, the occasional crack of a tree branch, the sounds of the night that should have been normal felt strange. I pulled the blankets up around me and tried to close my eyes. Around 2 a.m., I heard something that made me sit up straight in bed. A faint knocking, almost like someone was tapping on the window. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I got out of bed and stood at the window, but all I could see was the dark outline of the trees swaying in the wind. I convinced myself it was just the wind making branches hit the cabin, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I checked the locks on the door and the windows before going back to bed, keeping the lights off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The next day, I woke up feeling strange, not rested, but off. I tried to shake it off and make the most of my day. I spent some time hiking the nearby trails, trying to connect with nature, but I couldn't get the nagging feeling out of my head. I kept looking over my shoulder, as if expecting someone to be following me. The woods were beautiful, sure, but they felt isolating in a way that was starting to unsettle me. The more I walked, the more I noticed little details that made the place feel wrong. The ground was soft, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The trees were too dense, blocking out the sunlight, making everything feel darker. I didn't like it. The woods felt like they were closing in on me. That night, I lit the fire again and tried to enjoy the evening. But I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder. Every sound outside felt more deliberate. When I went to bed, I checked the windows and doors again, but this time, I locked them with an almost obsessive precision. I lay there for hours just listening, and then it came again, the tapping on the window, soft but distinct. I froze. My pulse raced. I didn't move. I just stared at the window, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But I couldn't. The tapping continued, rhythmic, like someone was tapping with their fingers or something larger, maybe a stick. I slowly got up, my heart pounding in my chest. I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. There was nothing, just darkness. The trees swayed, and the wind rustled the leaves. I backed away from the window, but as I turned, I heard it again. This time, it came from the back of the cabin. It wasn't the wind anymore. It was something else. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I tried to remember if I had heard anything about the area. Stories of locals, anything that could explain what was happening. But nothing came to mind. I thought about leaving, but the road back to town was hours away, and the sun would be down soon. Besides, what if I was just imagining it? The isolation was playing tricks on me. I stayed up the rest of the night, lying awake in bed, listening. Every once in a while, I heard a noise. Another knock, another tap. It was always coming from somewhere else, always distant. I couldn't tell if it was someone out there or just my mind running wild. The wind picked up again, but the sounds kept going. The creaking of the cabin's frame became more pronounced. In the morning, I decided it was time to go. I packed my things quickly, not bothering to eat breakfast. The tapping stopped once the sun rose, but I didn't feel any safer. I locked the door behind me and drove out of the woods, the road feeling longer and more winding than it had the day before. I didn't look back. When I got home, I never really talked about it. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I didn't want to admit how terrified I had been. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was something else entirely. But whatever it was, I didn't want to find out again. I hadn't planned on going to the cabin that weekend, but when my buddy Steve called, practically begging me to join him, I thought, why not? A break from the hustle and bustle of city life seemed like exactly what I needed. I packed a bag, threw in a couple of beers, and hit the road. The drive was long, winding through the dense woods as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The further I drove, the less I could see of the modern world. The forest seemed to close in on the road, a never-ending canopy of trees above. The cabin was way out in the middle of nowhere, tucked in a valley that barely had phone signal. I finally arrived as the sky was starting to darken, pulling up to the old cabin. It wasn't much, just a small, weathered wooden structure with a sagging porch. But the place had its charm. There were a couple of chairs set up outside, facing the small lake just beyond the cabin. The water reflected the setting sun, casting a golden glow across everything. It was peaceful, too peaceful almost, considering how far we were from anything. Steve was already there, sitting on the porch with a beer in his hand. He stood up as I got out of the car, grinning wide. "Glad you made it, man," he said, his voice relaxed. "Come on in. It's good to be out here, away from everything." I nodded and grabbed my bag from the trunk. The air smelled fresh, like pine and damp earth. It was the kind of scent that instantly reminded me of childhood trips to the woods, where the air always felt cleaner, the world quieter. As I walked toward the cabin, the floorboards creaked under my feet. Steve led the way inside. The cabin had a cozy feel to it, despite its age. The wooden beams of the ceiling were exposed, and the place had a musty scent of old wood mixed with the faint smell of campfire smoke. A few old couches were scattered around the room, and there was a fireplace in the center, surrounded by shelves filled with books and knickknacks that seemed to have been there for years. Felt like a place stuck in time. "We've got everything we need," Steve said, motioning to a small kitchen area with a stove and a counter covered in cups and snacks. "Firewood's already stacked outside, and there's a grill if we want to cook." "Looks good," I said, tossing my bag onto one of the chairs by the window. The view outside was nice, just the lake and trees, nothing else. I could hear the faint rustle of the wind through the leaves, a gentle reminder of how far away we were from civilization. As the evening wore on, we cracked open some beers and started a fire in the pit outside. We joked about life back home, about work, about women, just the usual stuff. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt the quiet weight of the forest around us. It was unnervingly still, the kind of silence you only get when you're far from any sort of human life. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. At some point, Steve got up and went inside to grab more firewood. I was left alone for a few minutes, staring into the flames. The fire crackled and popped, and for a second, I thought I saw something move in the woods, just beyond the tree line. I stood up, squinting into the dark, but all I saw were shadows, the shapes of the trees bending in the wind. I shook my head, laughing at myself. Maybe I was just tired. When Steve came back outside, I was still standing there, trying to shake off that odd feeling. He handed me another beer, and we fell back into easy conversation. The night wore on, the fire slowly burning down to embers. By the time we decided to call it a night, the air had cooled significantly, and the stars were bright above us. I was glad to be inside, out of the cold. We both settled into our separate rooms. The cabin only had 2 bedrooms, one for each of us. My room was small but comfortable enough, with a single bed, a dresser, and a small nightstand. I tossed my clothes onto the chair and lay down, staring up at the ceiling. The room was silent, almost too quiet. Even the usual creaks of an old house were absent. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and after a long day of driving and a couple of beers, I felt myself drifting off. But just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard something, a faint scratching sound, came from somewhere outside my window. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder. I sat up, straining my ears. It sounded like something was dragging along the ground, moving slowly in a circle around the cabin. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain. There was nothing, just the dark forest stretching out in front of me. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or an animal, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave. I lay back down, telling myself I was being paranoid. The noise stopped, and eventually, I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee brewing. Steve was already up, standing in the kitchen, his back to me. I stretched and yawned, rubbing my eyes. The sun was just rising, casting a pale light through the windows. "You sleep okay?" Steve asked, turning around with a cup of coffee in his hand. His hair was messy, and he looked like he'd been up for a while. "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I had. "Just a little weird, you know? The woods at night are different. Too quiet." Steve nodded, his face growing serious. "Yeah, I know what you mean. It gets to you after a while." We ate breakfast together in silence, each lost in our thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something just out of place, but I couldn't figure out what it was. It wasn't until later in the morning that things started to get weird. We decided to take a walk around the property, just to stretch our legs. The cabin was surrounded by trees, but there was a small trail that led into the forest. It was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of birds or rustling leaves were absent, and the air felt thick with tension. As we walked, I noticed something strange. There were no animal tracks, not a single one. No deer, no raccoons, no squirrels. It was like the woods were deserted. We kept walking, following the trail deeper into the trees, but the further we went, the more I felt like we were being watched. I kept turning around, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, But each time, the forest remained still. Steve, always the laid-back guy, didn't seem to notice. He was humming some old song as he walked ahead, lost in his own world. I, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We reached a clearing eventually, a small spot where the trees had thinned out. There was a pile of rocks in the center, and a weathered wooden bench facing a small creek. It was peaceful, but there was an odd energy about it. The whole place felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but my skin crawled. "That's a nice spot," Steve said, sitting down on the bench. He seemed completely at ease, as if nothing was bothering him. But I couldn't relax. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I kept scanning the woods around us. "Let's head back," I said, my voice tight. "I don't like it out here." Steve raised an eyebrow but stood up. "Sure, man, whatever you say." We retraced our steps back toward the cabin, but as we neared the trees again, I heard something. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps in the underbrush. I spun around, but the forest was empty. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. Steve looked at me, confused. "What?" "Footsteps. I swear I heard them." He shook his head. "I don't hear anything. You're just spooked, man. It's all in your head." But as we made our way back to the cabin, the sound of those footsteps lingered in my mind. Something was wrong out here, and I was starting to realize it wasn't just the forest that was strange. It was the cabin, too. We got back to the cabin, and I was ready to pack up and leave. But Steve wasn't having it. He insisted we stay another night, said it was just the woods getting to me. I didn't want to be the paranoid guy, so I agreed. That night, as we sat by the fire again, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. The small pile of firewood we had stacked earlier was now scattered all over the ground, as if someone or something had moved it. Steve didn't seem to notice, but I did. That night, I stayed awake, lying in bed with my ears straining for any noise. I could hear the soft creaking of the cabin, but nothing else. The wind had picked up, and it seemed like the trees were whispering outside. I kept my eyes closed, but I knew something was wrong. Something was out there, and it wasn't just in my head. When morning finally came, I didn't feel any better. If anything, the feeling of being watched had grown stronger. We packed up and left, heading back down the long, winding road. By the time we hit the main highway again, I felt like I could breathe again. The air felt lighter, the tension finally lifting. I never went back to that cabin. It was late October when I decided to take a trip up to the old cabin my uncle had left me in his will. The place was tucked away in the mountains, far from the nearest town, which made it the perfect spot to get away from the chaos of daily life. I'd never been up there before. My uncle had always talked about it, but I'd never had the chance to visit. He passed away a few months ago, and now the cabin was mine. I was 28 years old, working a regular job in the city, and honestly, I needed some time to clear my head. I didn't know much about the cabin, only that it was isolated and that my uncle had built it himself. It had been years since anyone had stayed there, and the idea of spending a weekend by myself in such a secluded spot both excited and unnerved me. The drive took longer than I expected. The roads grew narrower as I got further into the mountains. There were no streetlights, and the dense trees on either side made it feel like I was driving into the heart of nowhere. I had my GPS, but it seemed to lose signal every few miles. The last stretch of road was a dirt path, bumpy and uneven, and by the time I reached the cabin, it was nearly dark. The cabin was just as my uncle had described it. A small, two-story building made of weathered wood with a wraparound porch. It looked like it had been there for decades. The roof had a few patches where the shingles had come loose, and the wooden railing of the porch had splintered in places. Still, it had a charm about it. The kind of place you could imagine yourself escaping to when you needed to forget about the world. I grabbed my bag from the car and made my way inside. The door creaked when I opened it, but the lock worked fine. The inside of the cabin was simple but cozy. A small living room with an old couch, a fireplace, a table with a few mismatched chairs, and a small kitchen off to the side. It smelled a little musty, like old wood and dust, but nothing unbearable. There was a staircase leading up to the second floor, and I assumed there were a couple of bedrooms up there. After I unpacked, I started a fire in the fireplace. The warmth was a relief against the chill of the evening air, and soon the room felt much more inviting. I had some canned food with me, and after dinner, I sat down by the fire with a book, feeling the weight of the silence around me. It wasn't until around midnight that I started to feel uneasy. I was sitting in the living room, the fire crackling in front of me, when I thought I heard something, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint, like a tapping, coming from the direction of the kitchen. At first, I convinced myself it was just the house settling. The old wood creaked and groaned all the time, especially when it was cold outside. But then I heard it again, this time louder. It was a rhythmic sound, like something tapping on the wall. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just being paranoid. There was no one out here but me. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen any other cars on the road. But the tapping continued, and the more I listened, the more it sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen, my feet echoing on the wooden floor. The sound stopped as soon as I reached the doorway. I flicked the light on, but everything seemed normal. Nothing was out of place. No one was there. The walls were solid. I spent the rest of the night with my back to the fire, listening for any other sounds. But nothing else happened. The night stretched on quietly, and I eventually fell asleep, although I didn't sleep well. The tapping lingered in my mind, making it hard to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, I decided to explore the cabin and its surroundings. The weather was clear, and the sun filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow over everything. There was a small trail behind the cabin that led up into the woods, so I decided to follow it, hoping the fresh air and the quiet would help clear my mind. As I walked, I noticed the landscape had a certain stillness to it. The trees were thick and towering, and there was no sign of any animals, not even birds. It was strange. In fact, the silence seemed almost unnatural. After about an hour, the trail began to narrow, and the trees grew denser. The further I went, the more I began to feel like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something in the shadows. I eventually reached a small clearing. It was peaceful, too peaceful, and I stopped to take a deep breath. That's when I noticed something odd. A small shack hidden away among the trees. It was barely visible from the trail, its dark wooden walls blending into the surrounding forest. The shack was run down, its roof caving in, and it looked like it had been abandoned for years. I approached it cautiously, unsure why I felt so drawn to it. The door was cracked open, just slightly, as if someone had been in there recently. Against my better judgment, I pushed it open, and the door creaked as it moved. Inside, the shack was dark, the air thick with dust and mildew. There was nothing of real value, just old furniture covered in sheets, a few broken bottles, and scattered remnants of a life long gone. But what caught my eye was a small wooden box in the corner. It was old, with intricate carvings on its surface. Something about it seemed important. I knelt down and opened it carefully. Inside were a few scraps of paper, but one of them caught my attention. It was a map, drawn with shaky handwriting, marking the location of the cabin I was staying in. The map didn't make any sense. It seemed to show a different layout of the cabin, one that included a hidden room beneath the floorboards. I felt my stomach tighten as I realized the implications. My uncle had never mentioned any hidden rooms. I had to go back and check. I returned to the cabin as quickly as I could, my mind racing. I had to know if the map was real, if there was something hidden in the cabin that I hadn't found yet. Once inside, I immediately started looking around the living room, then the kitchen. I checked the walls, the floor, everything. Eventually, I found it. There was a loose plank near the back of the living room. I pried it open with my hands, heart pounding, and discovered a small, dark space underneath. I crawled down, my fingers brushing against the damp, cold floor beneath me. It was tight, but there was something down there. What I found made my blood run cold. In the corner of the small hidden room was a journal. I recognized it immediately. It was my uncle's handwriting. The pages were filled with strange drawings and notes, detailing odd occurrences he had experienced while living in the cabin. But the more I read, the more it became clear that something had driven him to madness. He had written about hearing things, tapping sounds, whispers in the walls, the feeling of being watched. The entries grew more frantic as time went on, with my uncle detailing his obsession with a presence that he couldn't explain. It was then that I realized the tapping I had heard the night before hadn't been my imagination. Whatever had affected my uncle was still there. It had never left the cabin. I suddenly felt a sense of urgency. I needed to leave now. I packed my things in a hurry, my hands shaking as I shoved clothes into my bag. But before I could leave, I heard it again. The tapping, faint but distinct, echoing through the walls. My heart raced, and I bolted out of the cabin, not stopping until I reached the car. I didn't look back. I drove through the night, my mind still reeling from what I had found. When I finally reached the nearest town, I called a friend, explaining what had happened. He told me I was being paranoid, that I should go back and check it out in the daylight, but I couldn't. I knew I had to leave it behind. To this day, I've never returned to that cabin. I don't know what my uncle found or what he uncovered, but something in that place had driven him to the edge. I don't ever plan to go back. Some things are better left untouched, and I'm convinced that whatever he experienced is still there, waiting for the next person to listen to its calls. It was a last-minute decision, the kind you make when everything in your life feels like it's slipping away and you need something, anything, to break the monotony. I hadn't been out of the city in years, so when I found that little cabin in the mountains, it felt like the perfect escape. I didn't think much about the location or the fact that it was in the middle of nowhere. All I cared about was the peace and quiet. I booked the cabin for a weekend in early September. The weather had been unseasonably warm, so I packed light, not bothering with much more than a few clothes, my camera, and a good book. The cabin's listing had claimed it was remote, surrounded by woods, with no neighbors for miles. That sounded ideal to me. The more isolated, the better. The drive was longer than I had anticipated. The GPS kept rerouting me, sending me down winding, unpaved roads that seemed to disappear into the thick trees. I had to stop several times just to get my bearings. The place wasn't even marked on a map. I had just a vague description and some coordinates that seemed a little too off the beaten path for comfort. When I finally arrived, it was already dusk. The cabin was exactly how the photos had described it. Small, weathered wood, and just enough space for one person to get lost in their own thoughts. It was tucked into a valley, surrounded by towering pines and thick foliage. There was no porch, just a set of stairs leading up to a plain wooden door. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The interior was surprisingly cozy. A small living area with an old leather couch, a wood-burning stove, and a shelf filled with books I figured hadn't been touched in years. The windows were covered with thick curtains, casting everything in a dusky, dim light. The smell of aged wood and dust mixed with the fresh, pine-scented air coming through the cracks in the walls. I made a mental note to open the windows in the morning. I set my things down and decided to take a quick walk before the sun disappeared entirely. The air was cool, and the rustling leaves had a strange kind of peace about them, a peace that felt almost too still. The forest surrounding the cabin seemed unnaturally quiet, like it was holding its breath. As I walked farther into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but I shook it off. The trees made strange creaking noises in the wind, and I figured it was just the wilderness playing tricks on me. By the time I made my way back to the cabin, the sky was dark. I cooked a quick dinner, unpacked, and sat down by the stove to read. There was no TV, no internet, nothing but the crackling fire and the occasional gust of wind. I had no plans for the next day. Maybe I'd explore more, or maybe just enjoy the solitude. But that night, sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing noises from outside, footsteps, perhaps, or the snapping of branches. But every time I'd listen more closely, it would stop. It was probably just animals, I told myself. The kind of things you only notice when you're alone. I pulled the blankets tighter around me and tried to fall asleep. Around 2 a.m., I was awoken by the unmistakable sound of knocking. It was slow at first, like someone was tapping on the walls of the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to ignore it, but then it came again. Louder, faster, almost rhythmic. I got up, my feet hitting the cold wooden floor, and stood in front of the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Just animals, I whispered to myself, trying to stay calm. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. I grabbed my phone to call someone, but of course, there was no service. The only thing left was the flashlight on my phone, which did little to illuminate the surroundings when I stepped outside. I hesitated, scanning the area around the cabin. The trees stood still in the night, shadows that moved with the wind. My stomach churned as I realized just how dark it had become. Even the moonlight seemed muffled by the thick canopy of trees above. I stepped forward, flashlight trembling in my hand, pointing it at the ground, trying to catch any sign of movement. There was nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my nerves. Just as I was about to head back inside, I noticed something strange. A set of broken branches near the edge of the clearing. They were fresh, too fresh, as if someone had been there not long ago. My pulse quickened. I knew I hadn't walked this way when I arrived earlier. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, so I hurried back into the cabin and locked the door. The knocking started again. This time it was louder, more insistent. I pressed my back against the door, heart pounding in my chest. The silence that followed was worse than the knocking itself. It was like the whole forest had fallen completely still. Hours passed, and I didn't sleep a wink. The knocking continued sporadically throughout the night, but I couldn't bring myself to check again. What was I supposed to do? There was nowhere to go. The isolation was part of the reason I'd come out here in the first place, but now it felt suffocating, like a trap. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the cold morning air. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. Everything seemed normal, as though the events of the previous night had been nothing more than a figment of my imagination. I spent the morning cleaning up around the cabin, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me. I didn't feel safe here anymore, but I didn't know where I could go. There was no one around for miles. I considered packing up and leaving early, but a part of me wanted to stay, to prove that I could handle whatever was out there. By midday, the noises started again. The same slow knocking, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging against the ground. I froze, the blood draining from my face. This time, it wasn't just the knocking. I could hear footsteps, dragging footsteps, coming closer to the cabin. I grabbed my camera, thinking it was some kind of prank or a hunter messing around. I wasn't even sure if I believed in it myself, but my instincts were screaming at me to get the hell out. I crept to the window, careful not to make a sound, and peered out. There, standing just beyond the tree line, was a figure. It was too far for me to make out any details, but the shape of it was unmistakable. A man, maybe. He was tall, his body obscured by the shadows of the trees. I couldn't see his face, but his presence felt like a weight pressing against my chest. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay, but I wasn't sure if I was safe driving back down the mountain either. The figure moved, slowly, toward the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I ran to the door and locked it again. The sound of dragging feet got closer, then stopped. Silence. I waited, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. Eventually, the silence became too much to bear. I grabbed my things, packed as quickly as I could, and ran outside, not even stopping to close the door behind me. I don't know what happened after that, whether I was just paranoid, or if there had truly been someone out there. I never found out. But I drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I was back on the main road, and the forest was far behind me. The cabin, with all its unsettling quiet and hidden dangers, was nothing more than a memory. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone about what happened. It was hard to explain. Harder still to admit I had let myself get so caught up in something I couldn't control. A week later, I received an email from the cabin's owner. It was a simple message, one that made my blood run cold. "I hope your stay was peaceful. Just so you know, the cabin was built over the remains of an old logging camp. Some of the workers used to wander off into the woods. They never came back. I never went back to that cabin. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods or at the edge of a clearing, I still hear the sound of dragging feet in the distance." The cabin stood alone, tucked away in the trees just beyond the mountains. The nearest town was over an hour's drive away, and the path leading to it wasn't marked on any map. The only way to reach it was by winding down narrow dirt roads, hidden beneath layers of fallen pine needles. The cabin, weathered by years of harsh winters and hot summers, looked like it could have been built a century ago. Despite its old exterior, there was something undeniably inviting about it. Maybe it was the scent of pine trees and fresh earth, or maybe it was the simple promise of solitude that I was desperately craving. I had decided to spend the weekend alone, away from the noise of city life, far from the bustle of constant phone calls and obligations. My name is Ben, and I was 28 years old when I drove up here. I'd taken the time off from my work as a graphic designer, wanting a chance to reset. Cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect place. A break from everything. No distractions, no one to talk to. Just me, nature, and my thoughts. The first few hours of the drive were peaceful. The air was cool and fresh, the kind of crispness that only comes in the fall. The trees around me were just beginning to change color, splashing the landscape with rich oranges, yellows, and reds. I could feel the tension from my busy life begin to melt away as I drove deeper into the forest, leaving behind the noise and chaos of the outside world. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. I parked my car in front of the cabin, the tires crunching over gravel and dirt. The air smelled of damp wood, pine, and something earthy. Everything was still. No wind, no birds chirping, just the sound of my own breath and the distant murmur of a stream somewhere far beyond the trees. I grabbed my bags from the trunk and walked up to the front porch. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a small, cozy living room. There was a stone fireplace along one wall, a small kitchen to the side, and a loft above where I could see a bed waiting for me. The cabin had everything I needed: a couch, a small table, and even a stack of firewood beside the hearth. The decor was rustic, with wooden beams overhead and a few old but sturdy furniture pieces scattered around. Inside, it was warm despite the cool air outside. I dropped my bags by the door and went straight to the kitchen, where I made a simple meal for myself. As I ate, I noticed how quiet it was, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, making everything feel heavier. It was nice, but at the same time it felt strange, like something was just off. That night, after I had finished eating, I settled down on the couch with a book. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a flickering glow across the room. The shadows danced along the walls, making the cabin feel alive in a way. I tried to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping into the back of my mind. The silence had become oppressive. Every so often, I thought I heard something. A branch snapping outside, a rustle in the leaves, or the faintest sound that I couldn't quite place. But I shrugged it off. It was probably just animals in the woods. I was in the middle of nowhere, after all. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. The bed in the loft was comfortable, and the thick blankets helped keep the chill at bay. I lay there in the dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. The wind outside had picked up, and I could hear it howling through the trees. It was the kind of wind that makes the trees creak and groan, like they're alive. Couldn't sleep. The wind and the silence worked together to keep me awake, stirring the air in the cabin and making the shadows shift in unsettling ways. I tossed and turned, finally getting up to stoke the fire. When I reached the stairs to the loft, I stopped. There was something strange about the sound. It was faint, but I could swear I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, coming from the floor below. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was just the house settling, but the more I listened, the more certain I became. Someone or something was downstairs. I wasn't sure if I wanted to investigate, but the curiosity gnawed at me. Slowly, I descended the stairs, careful not to make a sound. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I peered into the dark living room. There was nothing, just the low glow of the fireplace, casting long shadows across the floor. No one was there. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It must have been the wind. It had to have been. But then, I noticed something. The front door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it when I came in, but now it was open, just a crack. I froze, staring at it, trying to make sense of it. The air felt colder now, like something had shifted. I slowly walked over to the door and pushed it closed, locking the bolt. I didn't know why, but I felt safer once it was shut. But that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. There was something I couldn't put my finger on. Something wasn't right. The silence had turned oppressive again, and my mind kept replaying the strange footsteps I had heard. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something else to happen. The fire burned low, and the wind outside only grew stronger. But nothing else happened. It was just the stillness and the darkness, pressing in on me from all sides. By morning, I was exhausted, but I forced myself out of bed. The sun had risen, and the sky was a pale blue, clear and cloudless. I needed to get out of the cabin to clear my head. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside, breathing in the fresh mountain air. The sun felt warm on my face, and I was grateful for the escape from the stuffiness inside the cabin. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, taking in the view of the woods. There was nothing out of the ordinary, no signs of anyone having been near the place. No footprints or strange markings, just trees, rocks, and a steady stream running nearby. But the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent the rest of the day hiking around the area, trying to push the strange events from my mind. The sound of footsteps, the open door, the unsettling quiet. It was all too much. By evening, I was ready to leave. I didn't care if it was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. I just wanted to get out of there. The cabin felt too close, too suffocating, like it was waiting for me to do something wrong. As I packed my things and prepared to leave, I heard something, a faint noise coming from upstairs. The same slow, deliberate footsteps. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my things, not caring if I forgot something, and rushed out of the cabin. I locked the door behind me and threw my bags into the back of my car. I didn't look back as I drove away. The trees seemed to loom taller and the shadows longer, but I was relieved. The drive back was uneventful, and as I entered the town, I felt a weight lift off my chest. The tension that had gripped me in that cabin, that sense of something watching, had finally faded. When I arrived back in the city, I didn't think about it much. I moved on, back to the grind of my everyday life. The cabin was nothing but a memory. But there was one thing that stayed with me. I never did figure out who or what had been in that cabin. I'd like to think it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down I know that something was there, and whatever it was waiting for me to leave.